This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. 4 weeks ago, I received an email from a Los Angeles-based production company by the name of Bird Murmur that was making a film about a group of anarchist expatriates living in Acapulco, Mexico. They wanted to interview me for the film, whose working title is Stateless. I watched their footage and I was immediately interested in two people who were featured in the film who went by the names of John Galton and Lily Forrester. John and Lily were fugitives who had fled the United States. Both of them had gone to prison in Ohio for growing cannabis when they were teenagers. They were arrested a second time, and they were facing 25 years behind bars. So they fled across the border into Mexico, and they made their way to Acapulco, where they joined up with a group of anarchists who had formed a community around the annual Acapulco conference. John and Lily soon became dissatisfied with the values and culture and sensibility of the anarchist community there, and they decided to establish their own conference, called Anarcho-Forco, or The Fork. They also decided to live far away from the tourist areas of Acapulco, and they found a house on the top of a hill, in a neighborhood on the edges of what is considered to be one of the most dangerous barrios in all of Mexico. They lived there for 3 years. They established a permaculture farm with a garden, livestock, and a solar power system that John had installed. Lily made glass smoking pipes and wrote posts on Steemit for money. On February 1st, I was preparing to fly to Acapulco to interview John and Lily for the podcast and the film when I learned that John had been shot to death at their house. A friend named Jason Henza, who was visiting, was also shot, but he survived. And Lily, who stared the main gunman in the face, was unharmed. Last week, I went to Mexico with the film crew. Because of John's death, we've had to rewrite much of the film, shoot new footage, and conduct our own investigation into the murder. Our crew is still in Acapulco, doing work in dangerous circumstances. Unregistered is now a co-producer of the film, but we need help to finish this project. If you would like to donate, please go to statelessdoc.com. That's statelessdoc.com. But before you help, I ask that you listen. Listen to one of the most remarkable stories I have ever been told. This is my interview with Lily Forrester. So I'm in Mexico in an undisclosed location with a woman who goes by the name of Lily Forrester, or sometimes Lily Divine, who's been living in Mexico for about 3 years now. And you all now know the basic story. I believe this is the first interview you've done with the media in any kind, right?
The first one that's going to be released anytime soon. I did
Right.
one other interview, but it's documentary style, so it's going to take a long time.
Yeah. Well, this is
First comprehensive interview.
Yeah, I was going to say this is what's going to be different. You're going to get to really tell your story, and John's story, and Jason's story, and your parents' story, and John's parents' stories, and all of this. It's an incredible. It may be the most incredible set of stories and collection of people I have come across, which is saying a lot because I'm doing this podcast, which has been aimed at people like you for 2 years now. And when I came across you and John just in the trailer for this movie that was being made about you guys and still is being made about you guys that I became a co-producer on just before John was killed, I looked at that and I said, those are the two I want to talk to. And I could just tell, partly honestly by the way you looked. I went to college with a lot of guys, a lot of people, women too, who looked like you guys with long dreadlocks,
Yeah.
white rastas and stuff.
Yeah.
We're all into weed, you know, and we're also super smart, and we're able to build things that would actually I think they were doing sort of a concentrate thing back in the 1980s in the lab in the science.
Probably were.
So when I looked at you guys and heard you guys talk, I immediately, saw those guys in the past, but boy, you had done so much more and had such dramatic stories that I was immediately drawn to you. And I said to the filmmakers when they showed me the trailer, which has many characters in it, including you guys, I said, I want to talk to those two people. And it was at that time that I decided to be basically a co-producer on that film. And I think it was just a day or two later that John was murdered.
Yeah.
And so that of course for me and for us, the whole thing has taken on a new urgency, drama, and everything. But I wanted to talk to you. I've always wanted to talk to you desperately. There's something about you that I've never seen in a person, and I really want to hear from you. So I will let you talk now. What I want to ask you first is, what has it been like just in the past 2 weeks?
It's been like the longest nightmare I've ever lived in. It's one of those things where I still just kind of have a hard time believing it actually happened. And I look at the date, and then I look at, because I have a picture of him, before I moved him and everything. And then it becomes real, and it's like, damn it. Because I always expected to grow old with him. Mm. I expected him to accomplish a hell of a lot more than he did. We weren't done. So it's been a little weird, but it's been interesting because I'm way more like him than I ever expected. Mm-hmm. A lot stronger, a lot smarter, better at speaking Spanish. It was like all the advice he was giving me throughout our entire relationship kind of came to a culmination and just started getting put into action, which before that I had a really hard time following, the good advice that was being given, everything from think for yourself to stand up for yourself to know when to stand up for yourself. And that was all stuff that was completely foreign to me. I was the kid that when my parents told me, you asked too many questions, I stopped asking questions. And he was the person that when he said that to him, he was like, why?
It's funny, you do not come across that way. You come across as a very, very strong person, as an extraordinarily strong person, maybe too strong for your own good sometimes.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, especially after all of this, whenever I do decide to date again, I feel sorry for the guy that I date.
Yeah, no, but I love that in women. And, physically, you have another disadvantage in that way, in that you're small and you're blonde and you're thin and, you do not look tough at all. You look like the opposite of tough, right?
Yeah.
But there is something in you that I immediately saw when I saw you talking to the camera. I'd actually say even more than John. I mean, John was a phenomenal human being whose strength was absolutely superhuman, but actually there's something about you, there was some kind of a deeper grit inside of you, and I think that's because of where you come from.
I think it's partially what kept John around, because our relationship was in a lot of ways very frustrating, but he stayed for a reason.
Yes.
So did I.
When I saw you talking, I said, that girl comes from someplace tough.
Yep.
And you do, right?
Yeah, well, the way I've kind of said it is, I used to say, what a long, strange trip it's been, but it's not so much strange, that's just kind of not being honest about it. That's one thing John taught me, is to be honest about, what my childhood was. It's basically a string of tragedies, one after the other, and it was I just didn't know how to respond to any of it until I was an adult.
So what were they? Where did you live, first of all? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Northeast Ohio, and I was raised in various parts of that, basically northern Ohio.
Towns and small towns?
Yeah, basically. We moved a lot, partially just because we had to due to money concerns. My mom was essentially, she got pregnant at 18 and then just decided she didn't believe in abortion, so she kept it regardless of who she was having a kid with, regardless of the fact that by that point she was already a drug dealer. My mom, by the time I was 6 years old, like, I had already been in repeated drug busts. So, like, you know, I'd wake up to the police waking me up and taking me to the police station and arresting my mom for everything from selling drugs to marijuana grows. And it was just, like, one of those things where, like, I knew at the time that's just not how your childhood's supposed to be. You know, your dad's not supposed to come and pick you up from the police station and things to that extent. And by the time I was 10, really, probably earlier than that, my mom was on the run. So, like, she was, you know, wanted for some pretty serious, from my memory, heroin dealing crimes. And she got arrested once, and then I didn't hear from her for like a month, which was weird. And then we went to go find her and found everything in my house in a dumpster and everything. And I was like, okay. Right before that, she had given my dad custody, which I thought was weird because she had told my dad she'd never give him custody of me. And then all of a sudden she just signed it over, and then she got arrested. And then from that point forward, she was basically on the run, but she never left the state. So she was the person that, like, the cops would drive by and she'd duck down, you know. And she had bright red hair and was very obvious, almost as obvious as me. The only thing that could have made her more obvious is the dreadlocks that I have. And she managed to evade the police for years, and then she eventually paid a lawyer that my dad had used back in the 80s for essentially a marijuana case that went to the Supreme Court, like a marijuana possession case. And she paid him a couple $1,000s, and he got everything dropped, and she died a free woman. That was always my plan. I literally told John when we started dating, like, I've got a lawyer in case this all goes bad, because we were, you know, growing together from the beginning, so to speak. And when the time actually came, Judy, John's mom, called that lawyer, and she's just like, well, he died. So, but there were other strings of tragedies. I was raised partially by my aunt, and when I was 15, I experienced a very traumatic, essentially, death of her only child. She always wanted a kid. She raised she got pregnant, had a healthy pregnancy, and then when it came time to have the baby, they overdosed her on fentanyl by 5 times the, like, lethal dose of fentanyl. And she couldn't even move, let alone push out the baby, and they tried to force her to have a natural, you know, birth, but, like, she couldn't. The baby suffocated and died three hours after, and it was almost a 9-pound baby. It wasn't, like, unhealthy. That was when I was like, well, I'm never having a kid in a hospital ever. And it was just, like, thing after thing of that. When I was, right before I turned 18, I was on my way to school, and my brother was sending me weird cryptic Facebook messages. Mom's losing it. She's dead. She's dying. She's dead. And I was like, family has a kind of messed up sense of humor. So I was like, is this some kind of weird joke to get me to come to Christmas? Because I was refusing to talk to her. And no, it wasn't a weird joke. She had been hit by a semi and killed right before Christmas due to essentially a mental break due to her health problems. It was one of those things where last year she was alive, she was falling apart, she was having heart problems, she couldn't keep food down, like, it was one of those things where she was just dying, and I always assumed it was because of the drugs. But I started to feel that way in my own way without any drugs, and then I got scared, that's what led me to the carnivore diet. And honestly, like, there's so many things that boil up. You've got my siblings, like, I've got 4 siblings that are all from different dads, and they all lead tragic stories of their own, and I'd say that we're doing okay considering the circumstances, but the majority of us, like, we definitely turned out at the very least to be unique individuals, if not, like, some of us total messes.
So who was your dad? I haven't heard about him at all.
My dad was a very quiet man. Like, I describe him a lot as a hermit, because my dad was the one that taught me that you didn't need friends to be happy, because my dad didn't really have much for friends, and my dad couldn't really keep friends, and I never understood it, but it was one of those things where, like, my dad was a good, honest person, and he got taken advantage of many, many times. Like, his first wife was a crazy woman, basically, that left him for a woman, and then, like, caused a bunch of drama when my parents got together and everything. They met literally because my dad liked to smoke weed and my mom liked to sell weed. And they got together, and they were together, I think, for 5 years at least before they got pregnant with me, and then they had me. And then in that time after I was born, the first couple of years I was alive, my mom got involved with the Hells Angels. So at one point she had us living in an opium den, and I didn't understand this memory that I had until I was an adult and I read her journals that she called the X-Files. Funny enough, but it was one of those things where, like, she woke us up in the middle of the night and I was like, guys, we got to go on an adventure. We got to leave right now. And I was like 3 years old, and I was like, I just didn't understand it, but I woke up in my sleepy haze and I left with her. Well, apparently the guy that she was living with was coming to kill her and coming to kill us because she owed him money for opium. And it caused problems. My dad was always... He really loved me, but he also really loved my mother. So he tried to, like, fight for custody in a way to where it always would leave some possibility of getting back with my mom, or at least being friends with her out, when that shouldn't have been his concern. His concern should have been getting me far away from that woman and just raising me alone, and I probably would have had a much easier life. But he was doing everything from just going the typical courts route. At one point, he went to the police station in the town that he was in, and he was basically like, she lives with a Hells Angels, you know, essentially boss, and she's selling drugs. And he mentioned the name of the guy, and the cop, like, just turned all aggressively towards him and exposed his arm, and on his arm he had, you know, essentially a Hells Angel tattoo, and he was like, how do you know who the fuck he is? And then after that, from what I can tell, my dad kind of gave up, because that all came out when I was 18, and I was like, Dad, why didn't you fight for me more for custody? Like, she was clearly a drug addict. You have all these stories about her showing up on acid and stuff to pick us up. Why didn't you win? Like, you had a job, you had a stable place, you had a vehicle, like, and she was, why not? And then he explained that to me. Essentially, the Hells Angels in that county had total control over the case because they were involved with her.
Which county was this?
This was like Lake County, or no, it wasn't even Lake County. It was Ashtabula County in Ohio. Yeah, so it was like...
Even the cops were members of the Hells Angels.
Well, like that, it's kind of like that all over Ohio, and I realized that when we lived in Cleveland, like, there was a tattoo shop for police only in Cleveland. And they had, like, Harleys, you know, outside of it. And there was one day, like, I went to go visit my dad when I lived there, and I would visit my dad in town, and we'd go and have lunch. And there was just, like, I drove into, or I rode my bike into the city, and I saw, like, nothing but cops, and they had tanks, and they had their motorcycles out. And my dad was like, why are there so many Harleys with Cleveland, you know, Police Department? And I was like, well... Same connections that you had mentioned in childhood. This is just a bigger city. Like,
the Hells Angels became a second state.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Essentially, they're essentially, like, you know, in a lot of ways, they're very similar to the cartel system here.
Right.
But they're much older.
Yeah, less effective these days too.
Yeah, less effective anymore. From what I can tell, it's more of just like a motorcycle club.
Yeah.
But especially back in the 90s, basically when cartels were really big here, you know, like,
oh, sure.
It was very similar. They were getting a lot of their drugs from here, like, especially in Guerrero and I think Oaxaca, both are huge opium producers behind Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That's something most people don't know.
Yeah. So you told me last night the story of the night your mom died and the specific circumstances of it. Can you tell that story again?
Yeah, it was the morning. My little brothers were getting up from school. I'm pretty sure I was getting up for school, and they had been up earlier because my mom was essentially having what they called a psychotic break. She thought she was being chased by demons, and she, you know, we have to get out of this house. She was very paranoid, and she was seeing things, and it took like hours, from my understanding, for my stepdad to convince her, like, hey, you need to go to the hospital. And she hated hospitals more than she hated jail. She hated hospitals. And she really hated jail. She was on the run for 6 years. That was a given. But I think he might have convinced her or something like that. But he got her in the car, and he went to back out of the car, like, driveway. And then when he did, she freaked out and jumped out of the car and started running towards the street. And she made it to the middle of what was essentially a 6-lane, double lane highway that in the mornings at that time, it was like 65 generally miles per hour that people were going. It was a busy road. And she made it to the middle and she turned around and she's like, boys, they're coming. Because my little brothers were standing there on the side of the road and they're like, boys, they're coming for you. And my brothers are like, no, they're not. Like, they're looking around, they can't see anything. And my mom came back for them. And she got hit by one car, and then in the second lane got hit by another. And then from what my stepdad says he saw, she kind of stumbled, she stood up, and then hit by a truck. And yeah, it was so unexpected. Like, because she had been trying to contact me the couple days before she died. She was like, come to Christmas. But I was getting pissed off because I was growing into adulthood. I had almost, I was in the runnings for a like really important scholarship that would have paid for everything at an Ivy League school at the time. And I wanted to share that with her, but she wasn't responding to me. So I said I was done with her. And then by that point, she was like, come to Christmas. And I had already had plans for Christmas. So I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not just going to drop my life to come for you when you won't for me. And, yeah, then she was doing this through my little brother on Facebook. And then that morning, little brother was just like, she's dead, she's dying, she's dead, mom's dead. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And my family wouldn't tell me what happened. And the first person that told me what happened was my dad when he picked me up from school. And I was just completely floored. We had like nihilist in me. The first thing I came up with is my mom went out with a bang. Because she was one of those people that just had a very strong personality, and it was exaggerated by her health concerns. So she, she had her two personalities. There was Mom, and then there was Red. And Red was the drug dealer. Red was her drug dealing name. That was the angry woman, that was a lot of things, not enough a mother.
Oh. So she had red hair.
Yep.
You have very blonde red hair.
Yeah, my hair has been bleached by the sun.
Oh, really?
I used to have the same color hair as my mom.
Okay.
So it's been bleached by the sun, and like, yeah, it's mostly blonde now at this
point. I want to know how much you look like her.
In my face, I look more like my dad, and I didn't like necessarily realize that. The only thing that I have of my mom's features in my face are like my lips and my nose, because my dad had a big old like Native American nose to him. Okay. But like, and in stature, I'm a lot like my dad, because my mom was built, the way she always said it, is she was built like a teenage boy. Huh. So, me and my sister both had more curves than she did. I was taller than she was. I have thick hair, whereas my mom had super thin, super straight hair, whereas before this, my hair was very wavy. It was very thick. It was always a little lighter than hers. I'd never had freckles until recently, actually. I just all of a sudden started growing freckles these last 6 months as I've gotten healthier. But yeah, I was always a very pale kid compared to her and everything. She was essentially my bigger freckled, looked like she had been around the block a few times, was looking pretty tired by the time she died, but...
She died at the age of?
42. Wasn't very old.
And you were 17?
Yeah.
And how old are you now?
I am about to be 26.
You're turning 27?
I'm turning 26 in a couple of days.
Oh, you're turning 26? You're 25 right now?
I'm currently 25.
And how old is John?
John was 27.
27, okay.
Yeah.
And you crossed the border at what age?
That would make me 23 when I crossed the border, right? The goal was to make it by my 24th birthday, if I remember. Or no, by my 23rd birthday. So I was 22 when we crossed the border.
So when I was 23, I graduated from college in Ohio.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's funny how our paths crossed. When you guys went on the run, you went west, didn't you?
We went north.
Okay.
We went to Detroit.
Oh, that's right.
That was the thing. The thing with Detroit was like when we got arrested, what we got arrested with was stuff that we were moving from essentially someplace we had lived before to our home in Detroit. And we literally stopped at an abandoned house because, well, we loved abandoned houses. We moved to, I don't know if you've ever heard of Fireweed University. And we saw videos of that and we're like,
Explain what that is.
It's essentially 2 streets in the hood of Detroit, right off of 7 Mile and Woodward. That's basically like has a terrible reputation for the past. Most of it's burnt down, most of it's abandoned, and a bunch of white kids from the suburbs basically moved in, took over the house, and started gardening and started trying shit. But we were already, by the time we moved to Detroit, the first time, essentially, we had planned to, because we were living in Cleveland, and we had just been served an eviction notice in Cleveland. They said our house was unfit for human habitation because we didn't have running water or electricity or gas. So we got evicted because we were off the grid. But we were literally the only people in that neighborhood. Most of that neighborhood was empty, and it was empty because they had like taken houses from people through taxes, and then they knocked down the houses, and then they just left the lot. So we took those lots and we made big gardens out of them, and did that, which that was a lot of fun. That was like my first real anarchist, fuck the state gardening thing. We were off the grid, and that was the year we didn't really use the internet. We were just trying to practice. And the whole goal, the reason why we did it in Cleveland, it's the way John put it, is he would rather be learning that stuff when he was 15 minutes away from Walmart than out in the middle of nowhere with nothing. So we could always, worst case scenario, we run to Walmart and we pick up what we need to make things easier for us. But once it was clear we needed to leave, we made a plan to move to Detroit. And then we got robbed for all of our solar panels in Cleveland.
Oh. Your solar panels got robbed?
Yeah, we were in the process of moving from one house to another, and then that house didn't pan out. So we decided, so we had to move back into the original house, and we were just going to go to Detroit. And before we got a chance to move the solar panels, they got stolen. Everything got stolen, and it was basically a crackhead down the street that we knew who had done it. There were only one set of footprints in the snow, and they matched his shoes directly. Like, it was.
It sounds like a crackhead.
It was literally in the middle of winter. It was like -14 outside. It was the worst time for us to move to Detroit in the middle of winter. But we had like water tanks. We had all the things to build a rocket stove heater. So we were like, fuck it, let's do it. We're freezing our asses off here anyway. And when we lost our solar panels, we were like, we can't do it. So we essentially put everything into storage, lived with John's crazy-ass family for a little while, and made a plan to get to Detroit. And then Judy, John's mom, essentially moved us to Michigan, but she didn't want to just move us into Detroit. But it was like, we were there for like 3 days before we went and visited Fireweed University, and we picked our house that day and started moving in that night. And we lived on Robinwood, which we called Robin Hood, and it was right across from the Detroit Anarchist Park, which was totally, community-oriented and started. They put a grill there, they put a pull-up bar there, and all sorts of other stuff. And we were just moving stuff from that crazy-ass family into Detroit. And we found that house, and we're like, this is a crazy abandoned house. And we were there with our puppy, and we let him go out to go to the bathroom, and then the police rolled up. And they took one look at John, and they were like, we want to search your car. And John said, I don't consent to searches. And from there on out, they were pissed. They said something like, oh, another guy that thinks he knows his rights.
Ooh.
Is something they said. And there's a lot of things that they did wrong. They made us wait for hours before police dogs showed up. They didn't make me remove my dog, so the dog falsely marked on my car.
Now, you guys were growing cannabis there.
We weren't.
Oh, you were not?
We were just stopping there.
What?
We had some stuff in our car, and the stuff that we had in our car was like, they said it was a large amount of cannabis for distribution, but what it really was is it was cannabis trim that we had like blown and planted on composting. So there was nothing left in it. It was essentially just plant matter with all of the oil stripped out of it.
Right. Oh, I see. So before in Ohio, you told me the story about meeting John. You guys were students at Kent State University? Yeah,
and I was president of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And I was just leading one of my meetings, and it was the beginning of the semester, and I look over and I see this dude in a Ron Paul hat, and I stopped mid-sentence, and I was like, nice hat. He was in a drug rug, essentially, which is a Baja or whatever you want to call it, and a Ron Paul hat. And it was the middle of winter, so I was just like, okay, this guy's winter clothing. But I just kept staring at him the entire time. And he always he always made fun of me for that. The way he said is I had my Galton eyes on. So I had my big eyes, and I was just staring at him. And the way we started our meetings was like, essentially introduce yourself and why you're here. And he was like, well, my name's John, and I just, I just got out of prison. I'm a victim of the drug war, and I was never even convicted of a crime, but I spent 3 months in prison for growing cannabis. And then that just like hooked me. And we had a mailing list, and I was at a friend's house that weekend, and I just couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. And I was going to school for botany, so like the whole plan for me was essentially I wanted to learn how to grow weed. That was like why I was going for botany. I wanted to learn all of that. And I contacted him on Facebook, and it was within 5 days we were together, and he had already, showed me his current marijuana grow and told me he was going to teach me everything he knew. And it was like, well, this is what I actually want to be doing, But I was scared in some regards because, like, up to that point, I had been told by everybody in my family that my only chance for success and for happiness in this world and for, financial stability was to go to college and get a good job.
Yeah, so let me stop right here and tell you, I've told you this before, I want to say this on the microphone now. I have a 17-year-old son. And I would tell him to do the opposite of what you and John did.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to tell him that you're my heroes. So, tell me again, John had in college, so my son is thinking about going to college, and I'm trying to get him to not go to college and do something more interesting with his life. And now that cannabis is finally legal, maybe he can do that. But when you guys were in Ohio, this is what, 10 years ago, when it was very much illegal.
It was very illegal. It wasn't legal for medical purposes. It wasn't as strict as where, like, he had gotten arrested before, but it was one of those things where, like, I couldn't mention plants in text messages without him being like, oh my God! And, like, we had to be very careful about what we said. We had to be very careful about who we even told we smoked cannabis. Nobody was allowed to come over the house. But it was one of those things where, like, I chose that life and I jumped into it, feet first. And I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it for most people. Like, it's not easy. It's not easy to look over your shoulder all the time and wonder, like, am I going to get arrested and lose everything, Yeah.
Yeah, so you said he had a whole big backyard and there was a whole outdoor grow.
What he had was a garden, and it was a vegetable garden. That was his cover, was that he was just a hippie that liked to garden. But in his basement, in the corner of his basement, he had grow tents. He was like, he had it all figured out in a lot of regards. And not only did he have grow tents, he was like doing it like budget style. So he had plants growing like in orange juice and milk containers and stuff like that. But he also had it very discreet, so you zipped it up, and if you just walked up on it, you had no idea what it was. It just seemed like some weird tent.
So you guys lived there for a while?
We lived there.
Growing?
Yeah, we lived there growing, and we didn't get very far. We were only there a couple of months. I think we might have just started harvesting, and his landlord didn't warn him before he was coming in to do some maintenance, and he came in and he saw the plants, and he just emailed him a notice that he's like, not going to say what I saw, but I know it's legal. I'm not going to get you in trouble, but you guys have 5 days to get out of my house. Oh. And so we had to kill all the plants and regroup, and that was a big fiasco, to say the very least. And it ended with us basically struggling for money, living in an apartment, and unhappy. That was like one of his most unhappiest points, partially because he wasn't growing. Mm-hmm.
And so then you moved to Detroit. Or left college?
Well, what happened with the college thing is like 2 weeks in my relationship with John, can't believe I didn't mention this, but I broke my jaw on my birthday.
What?
My dad and my aunt and I, we went to lunch and we got a steak, and like afterwards they took me to, I think it was like Dick's or something like that. And my aunt wanted to buy me some like North Face jacket or something. Goods. Okay. Yeah, she wanted to buy me like a sweater or a jacket or something like that. And I was walking around the place and I saw rollerblades. And as a kid, I had spent a lot of time rollerblading. So I was looking at him, and my dad's like trying to be a good father. He's like, I'll buy them for you. And I was like, well, I do need an easier way to get around campus. So I went for it. And then I got back to my dorm, and I put those fucking things on, and I put on this, like, fuzzy North Face suit. It was February, and it was, like, in Ohio. And I was just going to go to the gas station for something. I don't even remember what I was going for. And I stopped at the ATM on the way, which was much closer. And I ran into the ATM. And I should have taken that as my sign. Like, you're not ready to do this. This is a hilly campus. You're not coordinated. You're known as a klutz. This is a bad idea. But I didn't. I was like, no, I got to try anyway. And then my stupid ass went down the biggest hill on campus. And I landed with all of my weight on my jaw. And I shattered it into 4 pieces. 2 weeks into our relationship. And yeah, it was like...
And he stayed with you.
And he stayed with me. And like, he even admitted that he considered leaving me because it was just like, I mean, what the fuck?
Yeah.
But he stayed with me. He made me smoothies like for months. He essentially took care of my weed needs because that's when I started using cannabis, because that was interesting, explaining to my doctor why I didn't want any Percocet prescriptions. I was like, I've got that covered. And he's like, oh, okay, I think you're using cannabis. And I'm like, well, I am.
Nice.
But it was one of those things where, yeah, he had every reason to leave me and he didn't. He stuck around. And then there was all of that. And over the next year and a half, it was just kind of a process of breaking up with my family. So I would get into tiffs with one bit of my family. With my aunt, it was, she told me to make sure I voted, and I had just like literally just become an anarchist. It was right after Ron Paul was refused admittance to the convention and everything, and I was like, the whole system's rigged, I'm not voting. And I told her I refused to provide consent for my enslavement. And she got really upset, and I just told her I didn't want such a toxic psycho person in my life, and I never spoke to her again. And it was just like one at a time of people like this. I started to realize they weren't what I had built them up to be in my head. Because, like, it's really hard to admit as a kid that everybody that's around you that's supposed to be taking care of you is shit. And that they're all kids and they don't know how to take care of themselves, let alone me. So it was like, it took until I was an adult and out on my own for that, basically. And then, so that was a painful process of like a year and a half. And it ended in, when we left the Cleveland house, my dad helped us move out of there, but his version of helping us move out of there was renting a truck and sitting there in the cold, like, why don't you move faster? But we had like less than 24 hours or something to move out of that house. And we had everything from grow equipment to our off-the-grid equipment to like, it was the middle of winter, so we had to try and keep ourselves warm. And it ended with him trying to fight John. John was on the truck organizing his stuff, and my dad was just throwing it in. And John's like, stop, you're gonna break things. Like, and then my dad's like, I'm gonna fight you, basically. And I got in my dad's face in between him and John, and I said, you're gonna have to beat the fuck out of me first, Dad. And he just backed down and he went and hid in his truck. And then the next morning, like, I talked to him and I was like, how would you feel? Because my dad's an auto body man and he has a lot of tools and stuff. It's like, how would you feel if somebody told you had 24 hours to move out of the shop and then told you what you should leave and what you should take and how you should pack it? And he acted like he understood, and he apologized to him. But a couple days later, due to this yet more family drama, like my aunt in that time called the police on me, saying that I was being taken against my will, and she blamed him for breaking my jaw. And the cop took one look at me and he asked me, he's like, I have to ask you this by law. And he's like, are you being taken against your will? And I laughed at him and he was like, okay. He was like, I understood that. And he's like, and she says he broke your jaw. And I was like, she wasn't there. She has no idea. Like, he would have to hit me really hard, like concrete sidewalk hard.
But you had a chance to be also a human trafficking victim, and you turned it down. Come on, Lily. You could have been that.
Yeah.
You could have been his sex slave if you wanted.
Yeah, and it was just like one thing after another, like all at once my family was, you know, and then even my dog died in that time, and it was just like, I just gave up on the family and I distanced myself, and the only people I was interested in talking to, and it still remains that way, is my siblings, because my siblings, you know, they went through everything with me. They were in the same boat that I was. They weren't responsible for making things better. So
there were 4 of them and they all had different dads.
They all have different dads. My mom maintained until she died that the 2 youngest had the same father, but they looked and acted way too differently.
But you guys always had dogs?
I had dog in my adulthood. Actually, we weren't really allowed to have pets just because couldn't afford them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had a cat growing up that my dad basically took over when I became an adult. But when we moved into that house, the funny story about that house was we were doing it with a friend of ours, and he was supposed to stay in that house and essentially in the hood of Cleveland by himself while we moved out of our former house, basically. And he lasted about a week in cold Ohio winter, and he called us and he's like, I can't do this, I'm going home. And he left before we even got a chance to get there. He was gone out of the house, left everything, tools in it and everything. And what I told John that day, it was like, I sat there thinking about it for a minute. I was like, he can't even stay there by himself. I told him to get me a phone and get me a gun, because I didn't have a cell phone at that time and I wanted protection. I was like, I'll stay there while you move out of here. And I did from that day forward, and it was the first time I had ever been alone, and I was responsible for providing my own heat. I couldn't even swing an axe, and I had to chop my own firewood to be able to support myself because we had a potbelly wood stove and everything. Like, crash coursed right into it. And like,
And you had a gun?
And a couple days later, what he brought me was, he got me the cell phone immediately, and then he went to his friend's house and he got me 2 guns. He got me a double barrel, like, granny shotgun, and then just like a regular shotgun, a bunch of shells, and he also brought this pit bull. And this pit bull was named Smokey Dog, and she was advertised as being old and senile. And I was like, oh God, I have no experience with dogs, like, and this is a pit bull, and she's angry. But he brought a bunch of licorice with her, and she loved licorice. And he also brought me some dabs, and I sat...
You gotta explain what dabs are.
Dabs are cannabis oil. Yeah. So it's just butane cannabis oil specifically.
It's a concentrate.
It's a concentrate.
Yeah, so it's concentrated THC.
Yeah, and so he brought me those, and he just left those with me, and he's like, you guys can get to know each other, and he went back to handle things. And I just remember this scene, and it was like, essentially in between where we would be is the wood stove, and I was sitting here, and Smokey was sitting across from me, and I like lured her over with a piece of licorice, and I gave her a dab, and then I gave her another piece of licorice, and she responded by climbing into my lap, like completely like climbing into my lap. And we were buds from there on out. And then that was the day that I realized that it wasn't her that was old and senile, it was her owners. And yeah, she was my dog, and she was with us through all of that, and then like through the solar panels, and then right after we settled at his aunt's house, within a week of us being there, she died of like some horrible random disease. Like, I don't know what happened, but it was basically like pretty gruesome, and she died and suffered quite a bit. Oh. And she was totally like seemingly healthy before that. She was only like 6 years old, and then she was just dead. And it was like, man. And then our goal was just to get to Detroit at any cost, but it took us so long because we were out in the middle of nowhere. We couldn't get work out there. We had no transportation. It was until summer that we were in Detroit, and within a week, Michigan, and within a week of being in Michigan, we were in Detroit in the hood. And I remember calling his mom because she set us up to stay with a friend of hers, and she's like, okay, they're gonna be safe and it's gonna be good. And then we're like, oh, we got this house. And she's like, how much you paying for it? And we're like, we're not. And she's like, what do you mean you're not? And it's like, it's a 4-bedroom house. And she's like, what do you mean you're not paying for it? And it's like,
squatting.
We were squatting, and we were in it.
That's what anarchists do, Mom.
Yeah, and it was so refreshing because we went from essentially having to hide what we were doing in Cleveland to being out in the open too. At one point, like, we interacted with some Detroit cops on our porch, and they were basically like, why this house? And we're like, what? And they're like, that house has a better roof. And we're like, but this house is bigger, and it's not, we explained our reasoning, and they just kind of shrugged, and they're like, well, thanks for cleaning up the community.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it was probably the best interaction I've ever had with any police in the United States.
Detroit cops are so desperate and beyond.
Yeah.
They'll take anything at this point.
Yeah, it was one of those things where, like, before that we had heard people say that they were accepting.
And frankly, it's because you're white, too. I'm sure
it was.
Yeah,
it was.
Sure.
It was exactly because we were white. Because they had the experience, like, of the other white people coming in and making things better, so they're just like, well, nothing's made this community better in 20 years but these white kids, so maybe there's something.
Did you guys have your dreadlocks then? Oh, not yet.
John did.
Just started. Oh, tell that story, yeah.
Okay, the story of the dreadlocks is an amazing one. When I met John, he just had like chin-length hair, and he was growing it out. And he said to me, probably the first night we hung out, these are going to be dreadlocks. And I was just like, I had never dated anybody with dreadlocks, so I was like, ooh, that sounds cool. And then I was like, why? And he was like, well, the last time my hair was cut, it was shaved by the government when I went to prison. And I was like, really? And it was 6 months later that I was there with a crochet needle at Kent State doing his dreadlocks, and he had them from the beginning, and he always had to hide them. He had them in a hat and everything the whole time. And that was actually one of the amazing things about getting to Mexico, and that's how we knew we were truly free, because like we got over the border and we got into Tijuana, and he looked around and he just took off his hat and he threw it down and he never put it back. And I found that hat the other day that he did that with. And it was just like, you know, we were home, whereas in the US he always had to hide who he was. And that was why I didn't get dreadlocks, is because like I saw the stigma that he got, and it was like, man, I don't need to make us more of a target. Not only that, but I was our legal face, so everything that was in anybody's name, from electricity bills and stuff, was in my name. So I needed to look as squeaky clean as possible.
Yeah, you know, right after he was murdered, I emailed you and I said that I wanted you to cut off your dreadlocks, you know, because I just for your own safety.
Everybody told me to do that. I can't even count how many people told me to cut off my hair. And like the thing that it occurred to me, and then it was like the first thing that jumped into my head, it's like, that'd be like taking off your wedding ring, like right after he dies and skipping out to the bar.
And now I know that.
Thank
you.
And I've gone through like a lot of trouble, like, you know, with the fact that I still have my hair and I'm so easily recognizable. But it's one of those things where like, I always wanted dreadlocks. So like when he told me he was getting dreadlocks, I was just like, I think I said, I was like, I want them too. And I don't think he took me seriously, but I had tried to get dreadlocks when I was a kid with my mom's hippie friends. I hated brushing my hair. I hated doing all of that. But my mom wouldn't let me. That was the one thing that, like, she was a hippie, but I didn't have personal control over my body because she wanted me to look just like her. Because I was the mini-me. I had the red hair and everything. So she wanted me to have the long, red, straight hair, when realistically, at that age, I should have had short hair, if anything. Like, because I wouldn't brush it. I hated caring for it. I hated having long hair. And so I tried to deal with it by doing dreadlocks repeatedly on myself and having her friends do them on me, and she would always brush them out. So it's also my way of living true to myself. Because every time I think about cutting my dreads now, I also think about, man, I really don't want to have to go back to brushing it and doing all that maintenance.
You know, it's the same thing I feel about both you guys. It's like, you know, I want you to be safe, so I want you to cut your hair off, but I also don't want you to, because it's who you are. It's who you need to be.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I've been at with it. And I'm going to feel stronger about myself once this is all over, and I look in the mirror and I'm still me. Whereas, like, I don't think I would recognize myself without my dreadlocks now. And then, like, I always could have, there was a chance that, you know, I could cut them off and I know how to reattach them, but, like, I'd have to grow out hair for a certain length of time to even be able to do that, because you'd have to essentially start small dreads and attach the old ones, and that's not ideal.
So you guys got busted with barely even pot. It wasn't even really pot that was usable.
Yeah, and a bunch of paraphernalia. And
you had both been to prison. You'd been to prison before.
No, I had never been arrested.
Oh, you went to prison after this?
Yeah.
On this. Okay, so talk about that.
Yeah, so what happened there was, like, John had been to prison for the 3 months before, and I had never been even arrested before. Like, barely had parking tickets.
You saw a lot of arrests with your mom.
I saw a lot of arrests, and I kind of knew that it was probably in my best interest to avoid them. But, like, yeah, I had never been arrested. And then, like, when all that happened, I remember, like, when we were sitting there waiting by the car and they were pulling everything out of the car and they found the things they found. Like, one of the felonies was just for having a scale on us. And that scale was just buried in our stuff. Like, we weren't selling anything or anything. We didn't have anything to sell, but it was like one of those things where, like, that was one of the charges. And there was, like, a good cop and a bad cop on site, and the bad cop was like, we're gonna fucking get them, and the good cop was like, it's not gonna be that bad. And he's like, well, there's maybe one felony here, don't worry about it, you're gonna get out, like, and don't worry about it. And I remember after we got arrested and I sat in the holding cell for hours, actually, why we got arrested, a bit that I forgot to mention is we were always on the lookout in SSDP, the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, for undercovers, for people that just didn't seem to make sense, that were they were asking questions, trying to get involved. And there was this one guy, and it was a black guy from Akron in particular, that was always like, I'm trying to start my own chapter, but it's like, why the fuck can't you get people to get behind drug policy in Akron, Ohio? That was always his thing, is like, you couldn't get people to, make the chapter with him. How do I get people to get involved? And then we're like, well, you just tell them the talking points, and then they should just believe you, and But I always was, skeptical of that guy. Yeah. And then I saw him, like, that day when we were being arrested. This dude pulled up in a black SUV, unmarked.
No way.
And he had, like, gold necklace on, and he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, look who we have here."
No.
And then he said, "I don't know what it's gonna be yet, but it's gonna stick."
No.
And the fat cop that was, like, playing the nice cop looks at me and he's like, "He doesn't mean that." And I was like, yes, he does. He knows who I am. And that guy is the guy that assembled my charges, and he's the one that's charged us each with 5 felonies, all related to cannabis. One of the felonies was for his assembly of chemicals, because, we had essentially butane and weed on us. And that was a new law. It essentially lumped us together with meth cooks, because, like, that applied to the people that were, had the chemicals to make meth, but also if you had cannabis and butane, together in any form, you could legally be charged with that. And so he just threw the book at us. And I remember when they handed me my felonies, that fat cop was in there, and he looked at the stack. You could see it was a stack. And he just like, "I'm sorry." And I was like, "Doesn't change it." And the picture, probably my mugshot, like, people say I looked like a tweaker because I was just like this, because they just handed me it. I saw what they were charging me with, and then they're like, "Smile." And it was just like, damn it. Yeah. Damn it, that was such a mess.
Okay. Did you ever get that undercover cop's name?
No. I don't remember.
Is there a way to find that?
Maybe.
Do you know
a lawyer might be able to find it.
Do you know the prosecutor's name?
No, but I do remember when the prosecutor implied, because, like, John was talking to his mom on the phone a lot, and at one point she was just like, "Well, when this is all done, like, where do you guys want to go? Can you go to Oregon where it's legal?" Like, and what he said was, "I would rather just leave the country."
So hang on. So there was a prosecutor and a cop who set you up, and was there a judge? Had to be at some point?
Yeah, there was a judge, but she wasn't really involved other than just being the judge.
So which county was this? Which DA's office was this?
I don't know the DA's office. It was just...
This is Detroit.
This was in Ohio.
This was back in Ohio.
Yeah, this was back in Ohio. Okay. We had gone back to Ohio from Detroit, pick up things from family's house, and then on the way back, that's when we got picked up.
I see. You were picked up in Ohio.
Yeah.
So these have always been Ohio charges that you've been on the run from.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, because Ohio is going to be legalizing soon, right?
Well, Ohio is technically already legalized for medical purposes.
Right. So that's why I wanted to get the names of all these people who did this to you, because now times are changing, and now when we start doxing them, we have a little power on our side. No longer are we just victims of them.
Yeah.
I think that's why I want to actually start to kind of, do a little payback. I think it's time. And I don't mean anything physical. I mean just letting them know that they need to be accountable for what they did to people. So I think it's very important to be very public about their names, the prosecutors and the cops and the judges who did this to people like you. Now that we as a society have decided that what you did was perfectly fine. Not only that, but that these state government budgets are running largely on the taxes generated by cannabis now, in particular in my new state of Oregon.
Yeah.
So I would like to start naming names, but we'll find it. We'll find the names of the people who did this to you, and we'll publicize them on my website. And I think other people should do the same thing too. I'm not talking about doxing. I'm not talking about going to anybody's house. I'm not talking about physical threats. I'm talking about just asking them some questions about how they feel about what they did.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, they saw easy targets, and they saw John, and John was very, not cooperative. He refused their DNA swab. There was the whole story where they tried to force me with that.
So let's talk about this amazing human being known as John Galton, who was born Shane Kress.
Yes.
Who was your partner, boyfriend, and then you later called him your husband, even though you were never legally married.
Yeah, it was one of those things where, like, we talked about it a little bit in the weeks before he died, and he, like, he made a comment. He was like, well, we're not married, but like, you don't really get more married than going on the run together. Like, that's pretty legally binding, technically speaking.
It's binding in a lot of ways. So, newsflash, you guys aren't perfect.
We're totally human beings.
You guys have, before I met you, reputations. I never saw anything on video, but you guys had reputations of being, abrasive, I think was the word I heard.
I made a joke earlier today because I bought a cactus somewhere in John's memory because he used to buy me a cactus every time we'd go to Home Depot together. And I said, I like my men like I like my cactuses, sharp and abrasive.
I mean, I never met the guy. He didn't come across that way in his video interviews, but I have heard from a number of people, including you, that he had that and anger issues, right?
Yeah, it wasn't, I wouldn't say so much anger issues as patience issues.
I have those too.
Yeah,
but the thing is that
they could make him
when the
angry.
patience when the patience runs out, then you get angry, and that's not so good. So
he was always like very motivated towards living his best life. So like he was one person that just, if something wasn't absolutely perfect, he couldn't ignore it. He wasn't interested in.
Do you remember what his grandmother said last night about him? About how I think she said something about how she had come to peace with it, or at least partly because. How'd she put it? Like, he lived the way he wanted to live.
He lived the way he wanted to live, and she chose to pick her battles with him, because it was one of those things where, like, when he was right, and it just because you wanted to have the upper hand as a parent or whatever, like, if there was something that he was adamant about, he was not going to back down, and sometimes it just wasn't worth it. Yeah. And it was like, that was something I experienced, many times firsthand.
So I noticed, both had long, really bad histories with the state.
Yep.
From birth.
Yep.
You were born into it. You were born into the war on drugs.
Yep. And I didn't realize it until I was an adult.
You were born to a soldier in the war on drugs.
Yeah.
On the losing side at that time.
Yep.
At that time. Not anymore. But that time. He was not born into the war on drugs as far as I understand it, but something really, really awful happened to him at the very beginning of his life involving the state, right?
Yeah, the story with that actually got really twisted. The day he got out of jail, we saw his dad's side of the family, like his real...
You're telling your biological
father.
Who he only knew for the first year of his life.
Not even, yeah.
I mean, as a baby only.
Yeah,
right?
as a baby only.
Okay.
He had spent a little bit of time with that family, but I think it was just too painful for them to be around him because of how alike his dad he was. And it was also, I think in some ways, like, there's misunderstanding of what happened, because, like, what the family believes happened and what, like, he was told by his mom were two very different things. What his mom said was that, essentially he blew his brains out when she said, I don't love you anymore, because he was like, I'll disappear if you tell me you don't love me anymore. And she was trying to get him to make a change in his life, and she said, I don't love you anymore. And that led to him essentially going on an emotional episode. From my understanding, like, he had a gun up there, he was threatening suicide, but what actually happened were the police showed up and barged in the house and chased him upstairs and made him feel desperate, and then they barged in the room that he was in. From my understanding, he was right on the other side of that door, and the gun went off and he got shot, and he didn't even die immediately. Like, he died in the hospital. So Shane had no idea until that day when he got out of jail that his dad didn't technically actually pull the trigger and kill himself. It was largely the fault of the police who barged their way in.
And Shane certainly saw it that way.
Yeah.
Like,
as soon as, like, the family explained that that's what it was to him, it was just like, whoa. But it made more sense than what his mom had said. But, like, from my understanding, his mom was, like, at the scene-ish. She was outside with the police, but, like, she wasn't in there when it happened.
The state at least contributed to his father's death.
At the very least, they made him more desperate, and they chased him up in the very top of that house and made him feel...
Well, we happen to
trapped.
We have numbers on this. This is a very common thing with police. They get called out to suicides and end up either shooting someone or forcing them off a bridge or doing something to make them kill themselves. It just happened to a 17-year-old white kid in a suburb of Kansas City not too long ago who looked just like my son, a blonde boy, right? White kid, suburban, driving a minivan, backing out of his driveway. Yep. But he had been reported as suicidal. The cops show up and start firing bullets at him.
There was actually a guy that... The first person I know that was ever convicted of the crimes that we were charged with was the nephew of somebody I was in jail with. And he was like an 18 to 20-something-year-old. Like, he was young. He was about the same age as us. And what happened was he was threatening suicide, and the cops came in, and they apprehended him, and then they searched his house, and they found a little bit of butane and a little bit of weed in his house, and they charged him with felonies and put him in prison for 4 years for the one charge. So it was like one of those things where it was just like, yeah, we knew it made so much sense.
People now are laughing about weed. They kind of always laughed about weed. It's always been kind of funny. Seth Rogen made it even funnier. Good for you.
Yep.
You know, and so when we talk about people getting arrested for weed, we like to say, no, they don't really anymore. It's really just black kids in the ghetto who only get busted for crack.
No, from what we could tell, like, we were the only people, like, that had been were in jail for weed. I met one girl that came in jail for weed, but she was only in jail for 3 days, and it was for 3 days over a roach they found in a car that she had just bought. And, like, it wasn't her. She didn't smoke. But, like, for being the only people in there for weed, we were in there. I was in there for 2 full weeks. John was in there for 3 full weeks. Yet violent offenders were being let out on what were called PR bonds, also known as signature bonds. So you sign your name and you book it.
And I have a feeling that had something to do with your attitudes.
Yeah, it was. It was. We weren't willing to comply, right. And then, like, there was the whole thing with when we got booked. I didn't even think about it, and I just let them swab my DNA, and I regret it. And then John, he refused, and I didn't realize that. And they brought me in a couple days later, just me, into the booking room, and they were like, "You need to tell him to give us a DNA sample." And I gave him the typical response, well, I'm not his keeper. You know, I don't tell him what to do. If he doesn't want to give you his DNA sample, well, I guess you're just going to have to take it from him. And he wouldn't do it, and he made the judge tell them that they were going to hold him down at the point of a gun if he wouldn't comply and force it from him. And he said, okay, I just wanted to hear you say that. And then he gave him the sample voluntarily after that.
I mean, they must have hated his guts.
Yeah, and they were listening to his conversations with his mom, and the prosecutor heard him say, I would rather just leave the country, because I remember when I was sitting in jail with all those felonies, what was going through my head was, we got to get the fuck to Mexico. And, like, I didn't say it to anybody. I had, like, a really good bunkie, basically, and she told me to either go back to Detroit and never come back or to go to Mexico. And I just, like, you know, I just didn't put any allusion to it. But he had said when he was on the phone, like, and they even brought it up. They're like, we were listening to conversations with his mom, and he says he's just going to leave the country when he skips bail. So I'm here to propose no bond. So that was going to be like, we couldn't get out of jail, which, like, worse than murderers and stuff. There was a guy in there that was quarantined because they were afraid the general population would try and kill him because he had raped little girls, and he had bond. And he proposed no bond for us. And I remember, because I couldn't see Shane's face directly because he was facing a camera in the jail, like, in the courtroom, but I just remember the look of disgust he got on his face when they said that. He just shook his head, and then his lawyer butt in, and his lawyer, that's when he got us the deal he did. But originally our bond was $75,000 each for cannabis. And people were getting let on signatures.
And barely even cannabis. It was
barely
just the leftovers from
from I remember them opening the box when they found it, and they're like, this is good shit. And I was like, you must be stupid.
or not potheads, clearly. So you guys decided to go on the run then? Yeah,
when John got out of jail, I picked him up from the jail, and we got home.
Oh, tell the story that his mom or grandmother told last night about him refusing, what he wanted them to get you out first.
I didn't know this. Yeah, I was in jail, and I had no idea. I was in contact with Judy, but I only talked to her a little bit. I wasn't in contact with anybody in my family. And the only other person I was in contact with was John. I was writing him in jail, and we were writing love letters back and forth, basically. And at a certain point, like right before I got out, it became clear that I was going to be the one that was bailed out. Like, he told me to call his mom, and I called her, and she's like, we're bailing you out first. And I was like, why? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And she's like, what she told me, she didn't tell me that he said that. She said, I think it's a better idea we get you out first, and then we'll get him out. And I was like, okay. And she bailed me out, and I was bailed out a week before he was. And in that time, I found out that we had been robbed for everything that we owned in Detroit. Because, like, if you leave your house unattended in Detroit, they just clean it out. Like, It wasn't something we were mad about. It was something we were trying to prevent. We were trying to get people to go there to pick up our things while we were in jail, and they just didn't. They're like, oh, it'll be there. And it's like, no, not in 7 Mile in Detroit. And, yeah, apparently, though, he had told his Nana, who was one of the few people that had visiting rights to him, he was like, I don't care if I sit here for 20 years. You get her out of here. And I had no idea. Like, it was one of those things where he was talking about us both getting out the whole time. He never led on to that. There's a lot of things, like, it seemed like he never, you know, quite let on how much he did care at the end of the day.
So you were waiting for him when he got out of jail.
Yeah. And it was better that way because, like, he would have gotten out of jail and he would have been pissed that I was stuck in jail, and he would have been, like I was. Like, I drove by the jail while he was still in there a couple times just to, like, be a little closer to him, you know?
Sure.
But it was nice because, like, when I got out of jail, Nana took me to Goodwill and she bought me some clothes and she picked out this dress, and I was just like, she mentioned something about court, and I was like, Nana, I can't wear that to court. It was like it was the dress that I did that first interview with you guys in, that were like really pretty paisley dress. It was that dress. And it had pockets, and I loved that part about it. But I just remember I wore that dress that day to go pick him up, and, you know, now I kind of understand part of it was he wanted to have me to come out too, you know? So he came out of that jail cell basically into my arms, and instead of having to deal with a bunch of shit that I had to deal with in that time, I am thankful it happened that way, you know? Like, his family didn't need to pay $1,000 for me to get out, but they did.
Well, what I saw yesterday, which I didn't know about and I was very happy about, was that his mom and his grandmother really love you.
Yeah. When that all happened, I sat with Nana and talked to her for like 5 hours, and she taught me all sorts of things, like agree to disagree and all these other things. And she's like, she told me that we shouldn't fight, you know, what was going on. And she's like, I know the anarchist in you is just gonna want to stick it to these guys, but it might not be like that. She said, you guys got to be right and smart, you got to fight in the right way. And I just remember, like, up to that point, like, he didn't talk on the phone to very many people, but every once in a while he would call his Nana and he would sit there on the phone with her for hours on end, sometimes crying. Like, he would just talk to her. And I was like, I remember, like, man, I wish I had somebody in my family that I cared about that much, that trusted me, that, you know, that I could trust that much. And that day, that's when she was just like, well, I'm your Nana too. And I was just like, oh, okay. And then it was that day that I decided I wanted to be like her when I was old. Because it was like, I want, you know, to... And when I have grandkids, I'm not going to let them call me grandma. I'm going to be Nana no matter what, just because she is such an inspiration in that regard. She was such a big part of why he turned out the way he did.
Oh, yeah, I want to talk about that. So, wow, yeah. So yesterday I spent a lot of time with them in Mexico here. And it became very clear to me why John was who he was and where he got the skills, where he got the talent, where he got the determination, the courage. Women, those two women, his mother and his grandmother, are phenomenal. Yeah. Phenomenal human beings. Can you talk about his mother? I can't.
He always had such, like, a strained relationship with his mom, but you could tell it, like, hurt him, because he always maintained, like, there wasn't certain things that were addressed and fixed with his mom, that he didn't want her being around his children. And he told that to her. He was very honest with her in the same way that he was honest with me, that he wasn't ready or necessarily interested in having kids with me with the state of mind that I was in at the time. And it was like, I could tell, like, I could always see it from both sides, because, like, I came from a pretty messed up childhood. His mom had a pretty messed up childhood. In a lot of ways, she was kind of broken. And, like, he understood that more closer to his death than he did then. He couldn't understand why she couldn't just face the mistakes that she had made with him and, you know, really start to move on. And she was always trying to make excuses just because she was just trying to deal. That was the big problem, but he always was very appreciative of the fact. The one thing he said is, I was lucky my mom gave me freedom, let me do what I want, told me to go out and play, and lucky that she was... He always talked about what he referred to as the golden years, which were the first couple of years of his life, and it was just him and his mom against the world, and they were a team, and that was where they built that bond. Like, after his dad died, she buckled down for 3 years, from my understanding, and just was for him. And then she got lonely, and she went on a date, and then she, like, as she put it last night, she married the first guy she went on a date with.
Right.
And, like, from there, a rift got formed, because he always saw that as her choosing somebody else over him, some stranger that didn't have any, you know, want for him around.
A lot of us have been there, yeah.
And it was one of those things where, like, he was already feeling really not wanted because he was told his dad killed himself. So he's like, my dad doesn't want to be around me. This guy's supposed to be my dad. He doesn't want to be around me. And my mom's picking him. And he became very angry. And there was a lot of conflict. There was everything from, you know, suicide attempts to just general depression and angst. At one point, he told her that she was going to leave him or he was going to move out and go start his life and not come back. And, like, she eventually did leave the guy, but it was one of those things where, like, by the time it happened, he had just gotten out of prison, was still pretty angry about everything, didn't have everything put together, and so things kind of just got more strained. But she was always there. It was one of those things where, like, if we were in a pinch and we needed money, she was there.
But not just that. I think that was way less important. When you guys were on the run and your truck was breaking down, you fixed the truck in amazing ways, and because John had these skills that he got from his mother.
Well, no. What happened was he knew exactly what was wrong with it. And he called his mom, and she had no money, no job, and she still found some way to give it to us. The truck had a few problems on the way here. We actually bought the truck, and then it broke.
But she knew how to fix it. Because she had this whole career, right, as an auto parts, what was it? She managed auto parts stores?
Yeah, she was essentially an auto parts salesman for dealerships.
Yeah, so she knew every part in a car. She knew she could tear down a car and build it right back.
She had him putting, you know, dune buggies and stuff back together when he was a kid, putting computers back together. Not only that, but, like, the house that they lived in was in crappy condition because they were low income, so they were renovating it. So he learned electrical, he learned tiling, he learned drywall, he learned all of that stuff. So by the time I met him, he already had all those skills, and I was just like, I feel incredibly behind. All I've done with my life is do art and read, and this motherfucker knows how to...
By the time he was 18, right?
By the time he was 18.
She said when he was 11, he had LLCs, he had companies, he was like making these bots for video games that he would sell to kids for money, and he was making hundreds of dollars a month when he was 11 years old doing that.
Yeah, and he had always told me about that, and it was just like, I felt so, like, for so long, I felt so inadequate, because it's like, man, like, he had a lot of adversity too, and he just took it and was like, I want more.
I don't think too many people have had more adversity than you.
Yeah, and that was something that it took.
You had nothing to feel bad about.
That was something that it took him a long time to realize. Was like, I was really fond for telling the terrible stories of my childhood with a smile on my face. And then one day he, like, confronted me about it, and he was like, "Hey, like, you should honestly start looking at your childhood with a reality-based view. It wasn't good. Yeah. You had a lot of problems. Like, your childhood was fucking terrible. Your childhood was borderline as bad, if not worse, than my mother's." And, like, he had told me about his mom's childhood, and I was just like, whoa, that's crazy. So I was like, when he said that, I was like, oh. And I was really mad at myself for a long time because I didn't have all that he had, but at the end of the day, like, I was malnourished from birth because my mom had me on formula and I was lactose intolerant. So I always had, like, physical lower hand. There were points where we were starving. We didn't have food. Like, my dad took me to the hospital once when I was a kid and they diagnosed me with malnourishment.
Jesus.
And it wasn't long after that he had custody of me. But the damage was already done. My teeth were, like... By the time I was 10, I had, like, most of my teeth pulled because they were in such bad condition. Like,
oh boy.
Whereas, like, he always had that somewhat of a solid foundation, and I didn't realize that's where his strength came from. It was both, like, with his diet, because his mom kept him fed, and she kept him fed well. And it was also because he did have a little more stability. Like, I had my dad on the weekends, whereas he had his mom every single day up until he was, you know, at least 14.
Yeah.
And I was the 10-year-old where my friends would ask me where my mom was, and I'd go,
right. Right. You just raised your hands as if
I was like,
I don't know.
it was always, she could be dead, she could be just, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize necessarily the effect that had on me. And I was also really scared of, like, thinking about all of that, because, like, my mom blamed it all on her health issues, but it was one of those things where, like, I thought her health issues were related to the drugs. Mm-hmm. And I just thought she just didn't care.
Can I ask you something? And I don't want to be too Oprah or too paternalistic. If I am, just hit me or something.
Okay.
Have you had therapy?
Okay, so after my mom died, I went to one therapist, and she was a psychotherapist, and I would only go to her because she didn't prescribe medication, because I had a very negative view of antidepressants and everything from a really young age. I didn't want to have to take anything. I wanted to figure it out on my own.
You don't need it.
And after my mom died, my aunt took me to this therapist, and my aunt apparently had given her the rundown of what happened. And with the way my aunt told the story, it made it sound like my mom had died when I was 5 and I never got over it. Mm-hmm. But really, my mom had died 2 weeks, literally 2 weeks to the day before that I had walked into that appointment. And I just sat down and I started crying, and the woman was like, whoa, you really are a basket case type of thing. And then, like, I explained, like, she just died, and my aunt's like, and she's like, oh, your aunt. And then, like, she was the first one that, like, kind of helped me see a little bit that my aunt didn't understand me or what I was going through. But she also, like, gave me the bad advice that, like, a month later when, like, some random country bumpkin asked me on a date, she was like, maybe he's sent from God. And I, like, jumped face first into that relationship, and that, in a lot of ways, it messed me up. Like, it just wasn't a good idea. She gave me bad advice, and then from that point on, it was just like, I didn't trust therapists. I shared a meme about a month before John died, and it was like a guy laying on the couch, and his head was a clam with a pearl inside, and he had his clam showing up, and the therapist was like, oh, okay, tell me how it all began. And he goes to open his mouth, and you see the therapist grab the thing and book out of the room with it, like, got it.
I've seen, yes.
And I was just like, that was my therapy experience. That's what it felt like. It was just like, okay, I had no trust for anybody like that.
So you haven't had any since then?
Okay. It's all been self-therapy. When I met John, I had no idea you could do self-therapy. And, like, you
can.
Yeah, and he helped me find some books on it, and I was a librarian at Kent State at the time, so I helped myself find books on it. And I really did start to make some progress, but in a lot of ways, like, I woke up to everything all at once, and then I got really depressed really quick, because it was just like everything from I'm way more like my mother than I want to be, to all the people that raised me are shit, to, you know, I've got a big uphill battle now I have to fight, whereas, like, when I started that relationship, I was like, I got it all figured out type of thing.
So, you know, I'm not a professional. Okay,
yeah.
My mother is, but so what? So I'm not a professional, so take it for what it's worth. But I've been watching you for a long time, observing you for a long time. I've had very long conversations with you now twice. My reading of you is that you are very actually psychologically healthy fundamentally as a person. That's where you start, actually. I don't know how, it's a miracle, but you do. I see you as actually you're clearly very, very strong, exceptionally strong as a human being, as a person. I don't see anything that tells me mental unhealth, and what I do see is simply a person who's been through extraordinary trauma.
Yeah.
A healthy person who has experienced extraordinary trauma.
Yeah, and I've always held a unique view on mental health, especially since, like, as I started to get into the self-help stuff, I started to realize that mental illness doesn't exist. Mental illness is just the body's natural reaction to a really fucked up situation.
Or it's just a category we put on other people's weirdness, right? That we don't like.
But I also, like, and I don't mean to just, like, I guess rep the carnivore diet, but it's something I didn't realize until the carnivore diet is, like, food is really important for mental stability. And I was exhibiting, like, I said to many people, like, if you were to take me to a psychiatrist right now, and I was being totally honest with where my mental state was, I am not as strong as I am way more strong than I was 3 months ago. Okay. And when I was saying that, like, I was having a lot of mental, emotional issues, and I was just like, if you were to take me to a psychiatrist, they would probably, diagnose me as schizophrenic, because I feel like I have this mom demon inside of me, the ugly side of me that comes out, all the shit that I inherited from my mom, and then there was who I wanted to be. And there was like this big clash. I always identified with a character from a Stephen King novel, which was like a black woman in a wheelchair that had multiple personalities, because she had essentially the evil side of her, and then whose name was Detta, and then she had who she really was, and that was Odetta, but they combined to make this character called Susanna. And it was one of those things where, like, my mom was diagnosed schizophrenic, and I always was afraid that I was going to end up with her diagnosis. And then when I started exhibiting symptoms of it, I was like, I started looking into it, and then that's when I realized that was really just who I had been grown up and raised as, because I didn't really have a choice, clashing hard with who I really wanted to be. And it was one of those things where, like, I didn't actually really start to sort through any of that until 8 months ago when I started the carnivore diet. I was like, anybody that saw me in Acapulco last year was worried for my life, because, like, just my health. I was like, I have acne now, but I was covered in acne. I was extremely thin. I couldn't eat anything without feeling like I was going to be sick. And then, like, I was also dealing with a lot of mental issues. I was sometimes even self-harming. Like, I was suicidal at points, like, because I was scared.
And you were on the run. You were living in Acapulco.
I was living on the run. I didn't have any easy way out. And not only that, but I was becoming more and more like my mother by the day. Not just mentally, but physically was degrading in the same manners that my mom was degrading. Okay. And then it struck me that my mom started using heroin to treat the symptoms that she was dealing with. My mom also had the desire, when she did eat, she only ate meat, but she drank a lot of beer. And that caused problems for her. And she eventually, her body just fell apart, and she died from autoimmune disease, basically, is what happened from what I can tell. I also started thinking about my family, and, there was a history of mental illness in the family. There was also the history of the same sort of stuff that my mom dealt with my grandmother. And it's like, when I started looking into all of the things that cause food reactions, which are primarily autoimmune diseases, I realized that my mom's mental state came entirely from the fact that she wasn't eating what she was supposed to. She wasn't taking care of her body, and then she had kids, and we were born in a malnourished state because she was in a malnourished state, and then she malnourished me specifically further by, that. And then I was just set off. Like, I was the kid that came home from the hospital and slept 14 hours. They thought I was dead. I was a baby, a newborn baby, and I didn't wake them up at all, ever, for food. They had to wake me up. I was a kid that was known as an airhead. That was just, I was also hyper emotional. I was, Lily's just off in her own little world. They lied a lot about occurrences in my childhood because it was easier, because I would believe them because I wasn't with it mentally. I had, like, crazy allergies. There was, like, every summer for the first, 6 years of my life, I'd end up hospitalized from anaphylactic shock just because of mulberry pollen. And my mom didn't realize it was mulberry pollen that was doing that. I learned that myself when I was an adult. And it was all these things culminating. I mean, there was even, I didn't even know how to burp. I had to teach myself as an adult how to burp, which that was through the use of psychedelics and cannabis. And then one night I was sitting there and I was like, I wasn't feeling good. I always had a tendency to feel sick. And then it occurred to me I was trying to burp and I couldn't. And then I was like, well, I don't remember ever having one of those belches like most people have. And if you Google inability to burp, it's a totally real phenomenon. And yeah, and from what I can tell, it's, people that weren't burped enough or burped at all as babies. So, from my understanding, it's considered a lifelong ailment you can't get over. You just have to adjust for it. It's why I never liked pop as a kid, because I'd take a couple sips of it and I couldn't exhaust the gas and I'd feel sick, or I'd get sick. And it was all sorts of things like that, I found a satirical article that had a bunch of memes, and one of the memes was me after I have any amount of pop, and the guy was like laying on the bed with his pants unbuttoned saying, "Leave me here to die." And I was just like, oh my God. And then like over the next couple weeks, like John coaching me, because John was known for his belches, like I now can burp with no problems. But like I remember reading the post and they're all like, yeah, it's one of those things where it's a physical defect and you're just never going to be able to burp and you just need to learn to deal with it. And it's just like, no, it's one of those things where you can teach yourself.
So this is the thing. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you guys is I identified with you on one level. As I said, you know, I would tell my son to do the opposite of what you guys did, but you're my heroes. So I had sort of like a very, I guess you'd say like a low-key minor version of your childhood.
Yeah.
So I had a mother who took off when I was 5, but then she would raise me off and on after that. But and had money, was poor, but not like your poverty.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and we lived sort of in the hood, but in Berkeley. So like I was around black people and stuff and poverty, but it wasn't really like hardcore poverty.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of divorced from an early age, broken family, fucked up father, whatever. So my reaction to all that, which is sort of like, you know, a very like G-rated version of your childhood, I guess, was, and the broken family stuff and the weak and the messed up mother part was to go try to get a real family. So my whole thing was nuclear family. I'm gonna get married and have a kid like from the age of 14. That's what I wanted, and I was dedicated to that for the next 20 years of my life.
Yeah.
Right? To get that solidity, that house, that mom, dad, kids, dog, fence thing. That was my mission. I had it in my mind until recently. You said to me recently, in the midst of all this, I have this desperate need to be independent, whereas I had a desperate need to be dependent. I wanted to be dependent. I wanted
and that's new. Before John died, I intended on staying with him forever, and especially because like a couple days before he died, for the first time, he told me that he would be comfortable having children with me, and it was one of those things where like when he said that, I saw us having a baby within 2 years at the most.
Just before he died, he said that? Just
before he died, like 3 days before he died, he spent a lot of time talking to me about the mistakes he had made in our relationship and things he had missed and how he didn't have respect for my learning experience in general and a lot of other things. And then he ended it. He had always been very honest with me. We'd have conversations and he'd always say, because of your mental state, because I was in a really bad mental state, he's like, I don't want to raise kids with somebody that isn't going to raise them in a manner that I'm going to be okay with. But that, like, right before he died, he was just like, if we can, you know, essentially get our passion back, I see no reason why we can't start having a family. And that was what we had both wanted, because like our goal was we wanted a family, but we wanted it under the right circumstances, because I was born under the wrong circumstances. My mom got pregnant and was like, okay, and, you know, like started having kids, whereas like I always, like, my mom was always very against abortion. She thought I was too, but it was one of those things where, like, I always, from when I first started having sex, I was like, you know, I'm not gonna bring a child into this world unless it is absolutely right, unless the relationship is, you know, good enough, unless the guy is somebody that I want having, you know, I would rather have an abortion than bring a child into the world in the wrong circumstances. And that's something that John and I always saw eye to eye on, and it was at a point we did have to face that. I did have an abortion. But at this point, I think that's part of why he respected me, is because, like, when push comes to shove and you're actually pregnant, a lot of women will say that, and then they're like, wait, I actually want... It was one of those things where, like, he had enough respect for the fact that I was willing to know this isn't the right time, it's not going to be what we want it to be. And it was one of those things where, like, I always felt so grateful, and I still do in some ways, because when I do have kids, it's not going to be like I settled, you know? It's going to be they were wanted, they had everything they need, and we also spent 8 years talking about how we would raise those kids, everything from screen time to what if they ask us for money or for, you know, stuff, or spanking, all of it. We all had that figured out, and that was what we both wanted.
You had no models for that. How did you come up with that?
Well, I always said when I was growing up I was just going to do the opposite of what my mom did.
Good idea.
And it worked for a while, and then, like, when I thought about it, and I've talked to my sister about this, because she went down my mom's path and the fact that she just had some kids. And,
Oh.
you know, she has 2 kids from 2 different fathers, and they're great kids, but she also recognizes the fact that her life would be very different had she thought about the circumstances she was bringing those kids in the world into and who she was bringing them into the world with. It's something that a lot of people don't think about, and a lot of people don't want to think about, because when you're pregnant, that biological thing is telling you that you're supposed to make that happen.
And probably more importantly, the culture, the entire culture is telling
Exactly.
you really loudly all day long, this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And this is how to be happy.
Yeah.
This is when you're going to be happy, is when you have that kid. That's what they tell you.
Yeah, and like, we, in our own way, we had our own kid under bad circumstances that was Rebel Dog. That was, we had just arrived to Oregon, and our best friend in Detroit was actually a pit bull that everybody hated. When we moved down our street, I forgot about Renegade.
Oh, that Smoky Dog?
No, Renegade is different.
There was a dog named Renegade?
Yes, okay.
I can't believe how much I love you guys.
Okay, so Renegade was amazing. When we moved to Detroit, down the road was this big old black and white pit bull. And when we moved there, everybody was like, you gotta carry a stick for this motherfucker, you gotta defend yourself. And we had already had a pit bull that and we're like, we know how to deal with a dog like that. And when we walked by, like, we didn't even realize it was the same dog. We just saw his big, beautiful black and white self sitting on the porch barking at us. And we're like, oh, you pretty boy. And he just shut up and he tilted his head at us. 2 months later, his owner introduced him to us, and he was rescued from a pit bull fighting ring, and he didn't want to fight, so they were just starving him to death. And she rescued him, and she nursed him back to health, and that was the story of Renegade, and he was just a guard dog for that house. Renegade had a habit of getting off of his leash. Well, after he met us, he decided he fucking liked us, and he came by every day, and he would bark at the house until we'd come out and give him dabs.
Yep.
And then we got arrested. And I was thinking about Renegade in jail. I was like, man, I miss Renegade.
Wait, you were getting the dog high?
We've gotten all our dogs high. We've gotten Smokey high.
What
We've
happens?
got Rebel Dog.
What happens when dogs get high?
They get mellow. They get hungry. They're just a lot like
Just
people.
like us.
Just like people.
Cool.
Like, and they like it too. Like Smokey, if you did a dab around her, and you didn't run over and blow it into her nose, she would get very upset. She'd bark at you and everything. But yeah,
So Renegade, you took him in. You became
we became friends, and then we actually almost went to jail, which I'll explain real quickly. But what happened was, like, when we did go to jail, when we were gone, he apparently had gone back to our house because there were dog footprints through the house that were his size, like, looking for us, like, where did they go? And when we came back into that neighborhood, we just drove our car up to the house and we walked down the road, and when we walked back to our car, he was running around the car with a broken leg, and I had just found out that he had gotten ran over by the mail lady in yet another dog fight because this guy had a habit of walking his asshole dog through Renegade's yard, getting him in fights, and then he had the mail lady run him over. So he had a leg that was in the shape of a Z, and he was running around our car like, and he saw us and he tackled us. And then from that point forward, that's the only dog I've ever had that's just straight up picked me. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. He started sleeping at our house. He would bark at our house until we let him in, and then he'd scratch on the door. Like, he was just, and everybody was like, what are you doing? Like, our friends came over one day, and then, like, we opened the door, and, like, we walked out, and then Renegade came out casually behind us, and they fucking jumped, like, 10 feet, and they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, he's a sweetheart, and I was giving him love, and he was licking my face, and they're just like, and then, like, that night that his owner had showed me, they're like, all these people are afraid of him, but he had no teeth left. His teeth were all broken, every one of them. He couldn't really fight. So it was like one of those things where it's like, he was just a gentle giant, and everybody thought he was a, wolf. The one time I went and I bought weed with him, and he was in my car, and I pulled up to the weed house, and I walked up there, and I asked him for a dime bag, and then they just looked behind me, these big black dudes, they just looked behind me, they're like, is that Renegade?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, he's here to get some weed. And they're just like, okay. And I got back in the car, and he licked my face, and I looked over at them, and they were looking at me like I was the hardest motherfucker they had ever seen. And then at a point, the woman that took care of the dog, she didn't even take care of him, like he was starving and stuff, but she was possessive. She called the cops on us and told us that we stole the dog, and we were on the run. And we were like, I remember laying on the ground with this dog, And they're telling us to send this pit bull out to a bunch of police. And I'm like, that is the last thing I'm going to do. So when we left Detroit, we were really sad to leave him. Like, we even tried to buy him. I went up to the guy that really owned him, and I offered him money. I tried to buy the broken-ass dog. He had a broken leg and everything, but I was like, we really love him. And he's like, I'm sorry, I can't sell him. And I was like, all right. So when we got to Oregon, Nana's daughter, Shane's aunt, basically was like, I got these wolf mix puppies, because her dog was a wolf husky mix. And she had puppies with some random hippie's dog. And some of them looked like wolves, and some of them were medium like hair, and some of them had short hair. And I told her, well, the whole plan, we were already on the way to Mexico, so I was like, hey, we're gonna get one of these dogs, but we want the short hair one. She's like, well, get a long hair one. It looks more like a wolfie. I'm like, lady, I'm moving to Mexico. Like, I'm not doing that to him. So we got the shortest haired dog that we got, and I picked him up, and I held him up, and I was like, I wanted to name him Renegade. And I said, hi, Renegade. And he just looked at me. And I was like, how about Rebel Dog? And he went, and he had these big ears. And
he cocked his head.
Yeah, and he just cocked his head. And I was just like, we were on the run. We had no money. We had no income. But I adopted and paid for that puppy, basically. I paid for him with an ounce of Detroit weed. And I paid for him. And it was like dipping our toes into the idea of just like, essentially getting pregnant and having a baby without thinking about it.
Having a family.
Yeah, and Rebel was our baby, and, you know, Rebel was with me through the abortion and everything, but it was like one of those things where he taught us that we weren't yet ready to be parents, and he was extremely valuable in that. But by the time that John died, he was also teaching us that we finally were ready to have kids, because like he was just such an amazing dog. He was so well trained. He was such a joy to be around, such a sweetheart, so loving. Like, we learned a lot through that experience.
Where is he now?
He is with the police somewhere. That's my biggest regret in everything
I know.
With when John died, I considered just putting the harness on him and bringing him with me when I went and fled the house, and I just put him in the bathroom where I considered it bulletproof. And I tried to send friends to go get the dog, and the friends said that they were too scared to go up to the house, and none of them went. The police said that if somebody came that night, they would give the dogs up, and then they took the dogs home, and the police have come up with lies with everything from we just took them to there were no dogs to the dogs ran off.
So, we got you to Mexico in the story. I want to take a break now.
Okay.
And when we come back, I want to hear about Mexico. And
Okay.
I want to hear about what's happened since you got here.
Okay.
Okay?
Sounds good.
So you guys found your way to Oregon. You got it. Your truck. You got stuck near Grants Pass.
Yeah, we were in Grants Pass,
Okay.
and we were stranded because the engine on the truck that we had literally just purchased blew. We couldn't drive even 5 miles without having to stop and let it cool down. And John went and was just like, we got to figure something out. And we found a bright yellow Chevy S10, 1982 S10 on Craigslist. And I looked at it and I was like, I fucking hate the color. I was like, but, because I had grown up in
It's known as the ugliest truck in the world.
Yeah.
It's very ugly.
Yeah, I had grown up in an S10 that was 5 years newer.
Oh, wow.
And that thing was dependable as fuck. So I was like, that's going to get us there, though. And that's what I said to him. He's like, well, maybe we should bite our tongue on the color. The color might bring more attention. It might not. So we went and we bought the truck. We got money wired to us from family, and we bought the truck, and we just fucking headed straight to the border. We stopped. We saw one friend in San Diego that was living there at the time, and we were like, we had seen him in Detroit on the way, and we told him what was happening, and he was just like, you guys are crazy, but you do what you do. And then we saw him in San Diego, and he's like, you guys are really doing this thing. Like, you're in California, not very far from the border. Like, and we're like, yeah. And he's like, man, I wish I could help you. And we're like, oh yeah, you can. And then like right before we were about to part ways with him and go towards the border, we realized one thing. It was our 5-year anniversary, and we were so busy being on the run that we didn't even notice. But we been given advice by somebody that we had contacted here at Acapulco, like, how the fuck do we get over the border without being noticed? And he said, you got to cross Tijuana Friday night in a vehicle and we'll just wave you through. They won't bother you. And that was what we were betting on. And we had $50 that we were going to try to bribe them with just in case they didn't accept that, basically, in case they pried. And when we were driving through the border, like right before we left, we realized our anniversary. And then John's like, wait, you can follow us through the border. If we don't make it, if you see that we get arrested, call for lawyers, start getting people, you know, trying to get us out of jail type of thing, like get us help. So he followed us and we were going through the border, and it was the scariest moment of my life in a lot of ways other than the murder. And Rebel Dog was sitting, you know, on his hind legs and had his head right here, and I was just petting his head like, oh my God. And then at a certain point, they waved us aside, and we were like, and Dana pulls up next to us, our friend, he's like, and he just continues on, and he thought we had been arrested, and we get up to the border, like, and they made us drive through a vehicle scanner, and they made me get out of the truck. And then they made John get out of the truck and made him bring Rebel Dog. And I was like, oh, God. And then they scanned our truck, and then they had us get back in it. And they had us pull to the side, and they're like, well, is this your truck? And we're like, yeah. And they're like, where are you going? And we're like, we're going to Rocky Point. And they're like, how long for? And just a couple of days. And they're like, what's in the back? Just our stuff. And she looked behind where we were sitting at the line, and she just... And we left, and we didn't even know we had made it. We thought she had just waved us on to the next thing, and then we saw the sign that said Bienvenidos a Tijuana, and we're just like, I looked down and I'm like, does that mean we made it? Does that? And he's like, yeah, I think we made it. And then we got into Tijuana, and that's when he pulled his hat off and was like, we made it. And we got tacos, and then we got out of Tijuana, and he was just like, I'm going to need you to drive, because he had taught me to drive the day before in the truck, and I'm like, I'm not confident in my ability to drive, especially at night, especially not at all things considered. He's like, well, then we're camping, and he literally pulled over on the side of the road. We climbed in the back of the truck, and we went to bed. And at one point, like, a truck came up and it slowed as it drove by us, but it just kept going. And we woke up the next morning, we're like, we're free. And then we found internet, and we had messages from our friend. He's like, I've been trying to contact lawyers, like, seeing posts on Facebook and everything. We just messaged him, and we're like, we're not in jail. And then I got back like, oh, fuck yeah, or something like that. And then he's like, I'm coming. And he, like, just got his security deposit back from his landlord and just got the fuck out of there and followed us. We waited for him a couple of days, and, like, at that point, we had $50.
$50.
That was it. We didn't even have enough to make it to Acapulco, but we had to maintain that we would rather be homeless in Mexico than in jail in the United States. So we were just going to figure it out, and that's what we were trying to do. We were asking for donations, and yeah, then our friend met up with us, and he was like, I'll just loan you the money, and we drove down the coast, down the 200, all the way here, the scenic route. It took like a week with everything from when we crossed to when we got to Acapulco. And he paid for our hotel room the first night and got us an apartment and helped us get on our feet. Basically just loaned us a bunch of money because he knew we needed it. And then when we, you know, we had lived here for a little while in an apartment, but our first day there, we were standing on the beach, and John pointed up to the mountain. He's like, I want to live up there. See that house up there? I want to live up there. And I was like, yeah, right. That's probably some, like, you know, super expensive. It's not going to happen. But when we actually started looking for houses, he scared the shit out of the lady that we were looking with, but he just started driving up the mountain, and she was just like, oh, I mean, there's shacks up here, I mean, and that's what we were seeing, was mud shacks, and he was like, I don't have a problem with that if it's cheap enough and has a nice view. And then we got to the top of the mountain, and somebody had pointed out a rental that was right next to our house, and John and I looked at the gate, and it was a big red gate, it was a big white house on top of the hill, and we were just like, who lives there? And the guy's like, nobody's ever lived there. And it's like, what do you mean nobody's ever, what the fuck? And we broke onto the property. We just climbed onto it any way we could, and we got to the view, and we were just like, we need this. And it turned out that the guy that owned the property we had first looked at, his aunt was the one that owned the house, and she built that house as her dream house, and her intent was to die in it, and still is. And we're like, well, we want to rent it, and they're like, well, it's going to be expensive, but like what they quoted us at, which was 5,000 pesos, we were just like...
Which means what in dollars, US dollars?
It's about $300.
$300 a month.
Yeah, and we were...
And in your house, I've seen video of it, it's a fancy house.
Yes.
It's a beautiful house with a view of Acapulco Bay, right?
The best view in the city.
Yeah, it's at the top of the hill, behind the bay, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like... Within a week, we were living there, and within like a week of that, our friend decided he had business back home he needed to take care of, which we kind of knew was happening. And he just left us with some money in that house. We didn't even have beds when we moved into the house. We were sleeping in hammocks, so we woke up, we were sleeping with the view. Mm-hmm. It was 8 months before we even had the money to have beds in that house. Wow. And like, it was just... We were just living the dream, is what we kept saying. And it was beautiful for 3 long years. Like, we would wake up and we would just, like, it's to the point where I haven't even been able to watch a sunset since he died, because I didn't realize he was so into sunsets until I just saw him the first night he stood there like this, and he had tears in his eyes, and he was just basking in it, like... And he did that. All those sunset pictures that I shared, those were taken by John. Edited by me, some of them. There at the end, I started editing them. But every time it was an Acapulco sunset, that was John out there. Snap, 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 snap. And he just loved that place so much. It was to the point where we had lived there less than a year. We were renewing our lease. And we asked her how much to buy the place, and she told us she wouldn't sell it. And then she followed up with, if I ever decide to sell it, you're my first choice. And we always had the lofty goal of buying. What our plan was we wanted to buy it, and we wanted to have that house so that way we could come and live in Acapulco in the winters and live somewhere more where we grew up in the summers, like something like Ohio, where there's a lot of places like Oregon in Mexico that we've really liked. So we're like, maybe we'll just, snowbird it, basically.
On the run.
On the run.
go back and forth across the border like that?
Well, no, it was one of those things where, like, you drive an hour and a half north of here in the state of Morelos, it looks and smells like Oregon. We took an epic trip to Mexico City to buy some silky chickens, because you can't get them anywhere else in Mexico. And we drove there on the motorcycle, and we were going to drive them back on the motorcycle if our motorcycle didn't break down. And, but it was one of those things where, like, we got into that part of Mexico. It was, like, it was an hour before Mexico City. And all I smelled was cedar and pine, and I was freezing. And it was just, like, I was sobbing on the back of the bike, because it was just, like, man... I missed cold. Cold was always my reset. I was a winter baby. And then, like... we hit that, and I was just like, I could live here. And he was like, me too. And that's the type of thing we were considering, was like, one of the climates similar. Because, like, Mexico, like, people think Mexico is all desert and tropics, and no.
It's very diverse.
It's very diverse. Mexico City gets a lot of snow, like, very diverse. That's part of what we loved about this place, is because, like, if we didn't like something about Acapulco, we could just find somewhere else to go. It's a big fucking country.
So you're going to be a snowbird within Mexico.
Yeah. Love it. That was the idea.
I love it. Yeah, no, this is an incredible country that Americans do not fully understand how complex and incredible it is. So you did a lot with that property over 3 years, the two of you.
Yeah, we homesteaded. We started raising chickens. We tried to grow food. It's really hard to homestead here in terms of, like, growing what you're used to growing. And we ran businesses out of there. That was my glass studio. That's where the glass business was based out of. That's where part of why we got that house was we were already doing community dinners. So, like, to survive, we were just inviting people in our homes. And the whole idea was I would submit, like, this is what I'm making for dinner. This is how much we need at a minimum for you to come eat. Come on and eat. And then people would show up, and I would make them dinner, and it was our way of paying for our own food. And then that became our way of supporting ourselves at that house. Like, the whole part of why we picked that house was, it was like, well, this is a great restaurant location. People are just going to come up here for the view.
That's right.
And then they came up for the experience too, because it wasn't just the view, it was the experience of John driving down the mountain in his yellow truck, filling the back of the truck up with gringos and hauling them up the mountain, and then they get up there and it's the best view of their lives, and they ate. And how I set myself apart from Mexican restaurants was I was cooking the food that they couldn't get. I was an American chef in Mexico. So I was making pot pie, I was making lasagna, I was making all these things that these people just couldn't get.
Oh, yeah.
And that they were missing. Mashed potatoes was one of them, fried chicken, like anything that I could think of that was just like super American, I would make it and people would flock. And that was how we were supporting ourselves. And we even were doing that with the meetups up until the very end. Like
meet. You were doing MEAT
meetups. Yeah. When we went carnivore, we were just like, we wanted to start sharing it with people, but it was one of those things where we had long since learned that you don't get anybody to change their minds by just talking to them about it. You've got to show them about it. So we invited people up to our house. We fed them nothing but meat, and then those people would leave, and they're like, actually, I would expect to feel not so good, but I feel pretty good. Like, and then they feel good for days after, and it got some people to try the diet, and got people to take me seriously. And not only that, but they were seeing week by week my improvement. I went from being a very sickly looking like person to really looking completely different. Like,
and now you have muscles. You were talking last night.
Yeah, I never had muscles like this. Didn't exist before. When I would do this, it was just like...
She's showing her biceps, and they're real. She has you're cut. Your arms look like smaller versions of mine.
Yeah, I have like six-pack that I've never had before, and I don't work out. I don't do crutches. Like, all I do is eat meat and salt and water, and it's one of those things where, like, it was 3 weeks in, and it was undeniable. And I went through a depression, actually, because I missed candy. I missed fruit.
Oh, yeah.
I missed the variety of eating a regular diet, but I knew in my heart that, like, literally in my heart, because I had heart problems before that went away with the diet. Like, I was sweating the bed every single night, and that's like a really big early symptom of heart disease is night sweats.
Oh, yeah.
Regardless of temperature. It didn't matter if I didn't have a blanket on me. I'd wake up and the whole bed would be soaked with my sweat.
Oh, boy.
But once I started the carnivore diet, that went away. I also felt like there was like a belt constricted around my chest constantly. I couldn't get a full breath, had terrible anxiety, had constant headaches. Like, this time of night, I would be laying down in bed with an ice pack every single night on my head because of how bad my head hurt, because of jaw pain and jaw tension that I had experienced because I broke my jaw and it didn't get fixed right. And it was like... all of my like stupid injury mistakes and the fact that I was raised on nothing but candy and, you know, junk food all came and smacked me in the face in like a year. And then it, like, I got extremely depressed because like my mental state was failing, my body was failing me, and I wasn't even 25. And that's where I had gotten to my suicidal points, and I was really glad that John was with me during that, because like I had never been suicidal before that. He had. And he was there, like, to tell me, you know, like, everything from, you have that right, you can do that if you want to, but you need to be sure, like, you need to understand what you mean when you say, I want to kill myself. You need to understand the true implications of that. You know, and, like, he did it in a way that, like, when he had his suicide attempts, the biggest problem was one of the things that, like, not attempts, but, like, suicidal thoughts. One of the problems that his mom did that she might not recognize is she guilted him about it. So she was like, you know, you're hurting everybody, you're hurting all these people, but at the end of the day, what he really needed to hear was, that's your choice, but I don't want you to. And that's what he did for me, and I'm so thankful for that, because, like, it was scary to be at that point. Like, it was very scary to be at that point. And I, like, by the time I started the carnivore diet, I just fucking gave up. Like, I wasn't taking care of my teeth, my skin, my hair, any of it. I wasn't cleaning the house. Like, I just gave up, because it was like, what is the fucking point? I feel awful all the time. Like, what's the point? So it was all of that started to instill any bit of, like, confidence in my ability to get better, because things up to that point were just getting worse. And they were getting worse and worse, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was like, man, am I broken? Like, do I have cancer? Like, what's going on here?
So the meat diet really changed you, really helped you.
Yeah, I was on the schedule to do a talk on the 23rd at Acapulco called How the Carnivore Diet Saved My Ass. But it was one of those things where, like, I full-heartedly believe, knowing that this mental state I was in when I was still eating what I used to eat, if John had gotten murdered in front of me a year ago, I would have killed myself. I would not have been able to be strong. I might have even done it immediately. Like, it's one of those things where, like, I had no confidence in my ability to handle life. I didn't even have confidence in my ability to digest food. What made me think I could, you know. But it's one of those things where, like, when he died, I was standing in line at Walmart looking at his favorite candy, crying, having an internal battle, because part of me wanted to just buy the candy. And then part of me, something inside of me was like, that means death. Because if you spin off mentally because you want to have some candy right now, this could go really, really bad for you. You could either get killed by the people, you could get arrested and deported. And then it was just like, no, I've just got to stay strong in this. And it was actually World Carnivore Month, I think, that saved my life, because it was the longest I had gone without carbs. Literally, I had gone 29 days without carbs before that, and then World Carnivore Month happened, and I'm like, fuck it, I'm not having anything the whole month. And I lasted the whole month, and John did it. He cheated on day 23 with chocolate milk because he was stressed out. But I stuck it out, and I was really proud of myself. And then the day after the 31st, on the 1st, he died. And, like, that was the first time I'd actually felt proud of myself and my accomplishments in years. And it was the first time I think I ever really, truly felt proud of myself. I think my pride in myself before was false. It was built up because I thought I had an idea of myself as a strong person, but I was the person that would cry at the drop of a hat, you know? So, like, I had a facade built up about myself. I realized that facade was gone. I got really depressed, and then I got sick. And then all of a sudden, I found this, like, through Jordan Peterson and Michaela Peterson, I found a solution. And then all of a sudden, I stopped being angry at my mom, because I understood why my mother was the way she was. And I'm like, damn it, if my mom would have just went carnivore, she would have been a mom. Like, you know, and, like, it's just, yeah, it was one of those things. It was really the first time I could be proud of myself. And then that all happened. And I still, like, I had a tiny bit of Jell-O last night, but, like, that's mostly animal products. So It's like, everybody's been like, you've been so stable, I would be freaking out. And it's like, I would be too if I wasn't staying strong in the diet thing.
Yeah. Were you guys raising your own animals?
Yes. We had chickens and we had ducks by the time he died, but we had raised quail, and we also had 2 bunnies. But yeah, it was one of those things where we had always, like, we went vegetarian when we started dating, but, like, it was in a response to the crappy meat supply. It wasn't so much, oh, for the animals. It was like, we don't want the meat with all the hormones and stuff in it.
Right.
And then when we went off grid in Cleveland, I didn't have any energy, like, no energy. And, like, I would chop my firewood for the day, and then I would just be fucking exhausted. Because, for one, I had never done that much physical labor. It was middle of winter, and I was a vegetarian. And then, like, one day, John, he bought me, this was when he still had all of his Bitcoin, and he bought it with Bitcoin using the gift app at Kmart. He bought me an entire cast iron pan set and, like, 6 pounds of bacon. And I, like, looked at the bacon, and I was like, we're vegetarians. And he's like, I don't think we should remain vegetarian. And I was like, okay. So I wouldn't eat any while he was there, though. So I waited until he left, because I was afraid I was going to get sick. He'd eaten, like, 1 hot dog when we were vegetarian and, like, spent all night throwing up. So I was like, I'm not doing that if you're here. And, like, I made, like, a pound of the bacon and just ate it all in one sitting, and then all of a sudden had all this energy. And we didn't realize we just ate a fuck ton of bacon then and other meat. And we didn't realize we had put ourselves into ketosis then. But that was the best I had ever felt before I started this diet. It's all related to the diet and the gut health, and like I always scoffed at people that said that to me. I had the chronic acne, and I'd ask my friends, how do I get rid of this? And they're like, you gotta quit sugar. And I was like, it's not sugar. But like my skin only ever started to clear when that happened. Like when I quit sugar completely. And when I eat sugar, that's the first thing to flare up is my skin. And it's like, okay, well, part of why I didn't believe him is like, who are my examples, Only recently has Michaela Peterson come out with her story.
So you guys had animals. Were you planning on having livestock as a sustainable?
Yes, that was actually, the plan was to get 2 goats right after in Acapulco. We wanted them for dairy, and we also wanted them to clean our fucking hill because it's nothing but jungle, and we couldn't keep up with it, and neither could our chickens. But the eventual goal, especially as we got into carnivore, was cows. And a specific breed of cow, it's referred to as the Indian humped cow, and it's like one breed of cow, and it's out of India, and it has this like hump on it, but the hump looks like Wagyu beef or something. It's super marbled. And we found it at the market, and the lady's like, oh, I sell the meat from only this cow, and we started buying it.
Was this piccata? Is this your thing? The steak that you got last night that you liked?
No, that's picanha. Picanha is just a specific cut of steak, which the picanha off of that cow is the fattiest picanha I've encountered. But it's one of those things where, like, I also found out the unique thing, I was looking for a breed of cow that produces what's called A2 milk. What, like, people are intolerant of, as far as lactose intolerance is concerned, is actually just the casein A1 milk. It's just a protein. But if the cow has casein A2, that's actually very similar to human breast milk, and we can digest that no problem, especially in its raw state. So we had already known that before we found out about, they call it the Brahma cow too. And we knew that, and then we found out about the humped cow, and then John was looking it up, and he's like, this is our breed. He's like, because they were cute, they're known as docile animals. They're very nice animals and easy to take care of. Like Angus, I've been around Angus cows and they're mean. Whereas like these are super nice from my understanding. They're pretty cute. And then they also produce the type of milk that I wanted. And like I have the desire to consume milk, but it causes problems for me, so I don't. But yeah, we had literally in the weeks before he died picked out the cow that we, essentially the breed that we wanted to raise, and we wanted to have a couple of those, and essentially just the goal is always to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, and you were getting there.
We were getting there.
Talk about the electricity.
The electricity, because of his do-it-yourself childhood, he knew how to wire houses, and he had an interest in solar power. From the very beginning, we had solar power in Cleveland. Didn't really make too much sense, but here it made sense. And we got a friend to essentially invest in it once we got, we got gringo priced on our electricity bill, and we weren't having it anymore. So we stopped paying the electricity bill, and we started getting solar. And that was really when he sat down and he was just watching videos on YouTube, everything from Jehu Garcia telling you how to build your own power wall to videos about Elon talking about the Tesla power wall and everything. And there's a guy named Average Joe on YouTube that he was a big fan of, and he just threw himself into that, and he designed and built our home power wall, and we were completely off grid when he died. The cops also took that.
Yeah.
But
cops took your truck, your dog,
my motorcycle, my glass blowing setup, everything valuable, my TVs, my cameras, my drone, my computers, and the solar power, and I'm pretty sure they even took my broken washing machine. They took my grill, basically from what I can tell, they took what they wanted.
Yeah.
Because they assumed dead guy alone in a house type of thing, and then they marked it a narco laboratory because of his plants, and they're like, this is all ours.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Okay, so the reports from the police and in the media were that well, they reported that they found a drug lab in your house. The pictures showed about, what, half a dozen scrawny weed plants? Maybe
yeah,
more?
they were just barely out of clone stage.
I mean, you guys were huge weed smokers, so that's not any news.
No,
but no one cares about weed here. The cartel doesn't care about weed, right?
Yeah, and from my understanding, it is technically legal gray area to grow small amounts here. It's
so there's
just,
if
if anything, the laws that we were breaking were we didn't have permits to produce that stuff legally.
Yeah, but that's not why this happened, right?
Yeah, that's not why this happened.
Weed is not why this happened. And everyone agrees on that, by the way. Everyone agrees on that. Everyone says that...
That's part of why I haven't been scared away from the cannabis industry and all of that. I think if weed was more part of it, I would be more hesitant to continue using it.
Everyone says, including many of your critics who are themselves anarchists down here, say that the only way that gringos get killed by the cartel is by selling cocaine, and that's what Lily and John were doing. They were selling cocaine. So that is what is being said by people who were formerly, I guess, your comrades who run the Acapulco conference, people around that conference, some people who used to run the conference who split off from the conference say the same thing over and over again. Before I met you,
and none
every
of
one
those
of them
people
said,
knew us.
every one of them said two things. We don't know Lily and John, but we have heard from multiple sources that A, they were doing a lot of cocaine, and B, selling it, and that is why the cartel killed them, period, end of story. Walk away from it, Thad. Don't get emotional about these kids. That's what they did. Is that true?
Yeah, it's not true.
Okay.
Where those claims came from was a guy named Paul Propert, and that guy was the guy that was selling the cocaine. That was the guy with the...
So pause for a second. So this guy whose assumed name is Paul Propert, which is a lot of you anarchists down here take assumed names like you did and like John did, right?
He was also Agent Shepherd Spook on Facebook when all this happened.
So he's an American. He came down here as an anarchist to do this thing that this group has been doing.
He said he was inspired by us, and he came down here and he was trying to be friends with us. We essentially gave him work on our farm. We're like, we need help on the homestead. We're really swamped. And he just didn't. He was distracted by a girl for a long time. And when things went sour with that girl, right before in Acapulco last year, we let him move in with us. We pretty quickly realized that he not only had a cocaine problem, he had a cocaine selling problem. And we just decided, we told him, gave him the advice, be careful, don't sell in front of security, security are generally linked to cartel, just gave him tips that we had heard. So it was one of those things. He didn't help on the farm. He seemed, although he said, if you read his statement post, we worked him to death. He didn't help on the farm. All he did every day was he would take a bucket of water out and set it in the middle of the fields for my chickens, and then I would go out and distribute it to them. And that was all he did for us, and a little bit of chopping at the jungle for 10 minutes until he'd hurt himself, and then he'd give up. So yeah, the whole goal is to help him, and at the same time he was being ostracized by the community, but the person that was ostracizing him was a fucking crazy lady, so we couldn't take her word with anything. And then we were also swamped. We were trying to plan Acapulco, and we were trying to make that happen. So we just put Paul on the back burner. During Acapulco, we noticed the heat that he was getting, and we started to take concern with it. And then after Acapulco and Acapulco was over, we kicked his ass out. We put his stuff in the street, and we stopped communicating with him. He did come around. I would sell him food essentially because he was starving. And but we were done giving Paul things. We had given Paul, after Acapulco, we just gave him $1,000 in the hopes that he'd move out of our house while telling him, we don't want you living in our house. And he went and he spent that on hookers and blow, basically. And it was all right, get out. And after that, things were strained, and then we found out that he was essentially living with... It's a really long, complicated situation, but my friend Jason Henza, who got shot that day, when he came to Acapulco first time, he had a wife. And that wife ended up leaving him for the guy that they were staying with. Yep. And Paul moved in with that guy, despite us telling him we wanted nothing to do with that guy or anybody that wanted anything to do with him. We were done with that situation. And Paul moved in with him, and the whole thing was he was just getting money out of him. because the guy was rich and would just hand you off some money if you thought it could help you. And Paul was really good at coming up with a sob story. So he was living with Paul, or Paul was living with him. That happens to be, you know, my friend lives in that neighborhood. I went to visit my friend one day, and when I was leaving, I was going home. I noticed Paul and Hens's ex-wife walking down the hill in front of me. Now they think, and it's funny because he sent me messages where he's like, "You're not very good at hiding. I saw you wait." I wasn't hiding. I had places to go, but so I essentially at one point walked past them and they waved to me and I just shook my head at them and kept going. And Paul, that was when the messages started, and he just started spamming me, and then the threats started to come. Then eventually we published the story because people kept asking us, what happened to Mod Probe? Like, why aren't you friends with him anymore? So we decided to publish the story of what happened, because Mod Probe tried to do the same thing that he did with Hens's wife with me. He tried to get me to leave John. He offered to pay for me and everything, but I kept telling him, like, no, I'm here for a reason. Like, I didn't want to. And he moved out and things were kind of weird, and then that couple moved in and things got really weird, and we were just like, But it's one of those things where, like, I immediately told Henza what had happened. I was like, because Henza, after Paul got kicked out, Henza was the one that came up with his van and picked up Paul's stuff and moved him into his house. And we told him, he's bad news. You do not want this idiot living with you. And Henza just, maybe they're overreacting. Listen to Paul, because Paul played his best friend. And so I told Henza, I was like, Paul's not your friend. He's living with your ex-wife. And I had taken a picture of them and I sent it to him. So, he knew. And he immediately told Paul, and Paul immediately, was threatening me. And then when we came out that story about what happened with them and everything and why we were no longer in touch with him, Paul really went on the offensive. He said we were attacking people he loved and cared about, and that's when he started, he's like, I'm going to write a post about you, and then he came out with the truth about it, the founders of Acapulco, or whatever he called it, and that was just like the biggest slanderous piece of lies I've ever seen. But that was where he told the world that we were the ringleaders, that we were the suppliers, that it was all our game, and that he was just the lackey. And we were just like, it's a good thing most people think Paul's crazy, because, otherwise this could be a problem. Like, we just kind of like rolled our eyes and moved on, but it didn't stop. And he kept going, he kept trying. He was trying to egg John on for a fight because he wanted to beat him up.
Let me pause you for a second here. So the one thing that I was mad at you about, you and John, for before I got here, was that from many sources, you say this is true, that in the hotel where the conference is being held, which is the hotel where I am staying right now, that you, or at least you, John, and this guy Paul, had a room from which you basically operated an open drug market where any drug pretty much was available for sale.
Yeah, the person that's perpetuating that rumor, what I find interesting about that is, if anybody had the records of the hotel rooms to know who had a room rented, it was them. And they would have noticed that we had a room rented. They checked the records. We didn't even have tickets to stay in Acapulco.
You did not have a room rented.
We did not have a room rented.
That was not your room, but you were in the room.
We went in there once.
Once?
A couple times, I think. Okay. But it was one of those things, we weren't hanging out in there.
So you and John were not selling cocaine in that room in Acapulco last year?
Nope.
Okay, and Paul, you're saying was?
Yeah, it was Paul's Fiesta Supplies is the name of what he had called his store. And what basically, the room he was in was he found somebody that he could pay in drugs to let him hang out there because they just wanted to blow.
Okay. So there were, 2,000 people at the conference, 1,000 people at the conference, right?
Yeah, there were at least 1,000.
And probably hundreds going through that room during that long weekend.
It was so like...
So there would be
there were more than one room. There was more than one room, actually. He had to move because of the heat he was getting on. The first guy was like, I don't want you being in my room with, what you're doing. And then he moved to somebody else's room, like some guy that was essentially a recovered drug addict that he unrecovered, so to speak. And, it was just they were keeping that afloat. And we even told them, like, dude, like, you shouldn't be sleeping here. Like, this, you don't even have a room. Like, this is not safe.
I'm just saying that people listening to this who were at that conference, and there will be, you know, you should know. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of corroborating witnesses, one way or the other, whether you're telling the truth or Paul's telling the truth. So I don't know. I wasn't there, but people will know, having heard this.
Yeah, it's
You're saying no, this is not you at all. You were not selling cocaine.
It was one of those things where, like, we knew those lines and we were never interested in crossing them. It was one of those things that wasn't our game. We had no interest in the drug itself. And then, like, beyond that, it was...
Okay.
We knew, like, it wasn't just coke that's a problem here. Coke, heroin, and meth. Those three specifically.
Right. The powders.
You do not want to be dealing with
no
those.
Powders.
No powders.
Right.
And it was like, we didn't even, like... The weed, the cannabis products and edibles that we did sell, we only sold to Americans. We wouldn't sell to Mexicans, and we also wouldn't buy our weed directly from Mexicans. We always used middlemen.
And again, everyone has said to me, you're fine if you sell weed. Even selling weed is no big deal unless you do it on a massive scale because it's so cheap now because of legalization. The cartels no longer care about weed.
Yeah,
it's only the powders. Everyone says that.
Exactly.
Including your critics.
Exactly, and Paul knew that because after the conference, Paul had people after him.
Right.
And it was, you know, pretty obvious, and we were just like, we don't want that heat. And then it became clear, like, around Christmas, essentially, that he had blasted our coordinates, as he put it, to the local cartels and told them that we were the ringleaders. And it made sense, because we had just finished anarcho.
He sent the coordinates of your house.
Yeah.
And you said...
He also admits to sending a map of, like, a hand-drawn map and how to break in. Because he knew how to break in. He broke into my house. That's part of why I kicked him out. He broke into my house with drug addicts to do ketamine. And then I walked in, and I was like, the fuck are you doing in my house? And he was like, he needed water. He was dying. And I said, well, natural selection, motherfucker. If you don't have water when you do drugs, you die. That's, like, step one. Like, that's fucking common sense. Like... And he never understood that. He thought I overreacted in that situation, but it wasn't more than a week, and we were kicking him out of our house because we're like, I don't have, like, if I wanted to have drug addicts in my life, I would have stayed with my family, you know, like, and I was good on that.
You guys smoked prodigious amounts of weed.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
We were known as getting people, like, gringo high. Like, anytime one of our Mexican friends would smoke with us, they'd get too high.
Right, because you were dabbing and doing intense concentrates. And but if anyone has been around serious stoners like that, you know that they're very high-functioning people, and often you can't even tell that there's any THC.
That was like, we had changed the opinion of this old man. Like, when we moved here, he didn't really have a good opinion
There's
of
a bunch of THC in you right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody could tell.
Yeah. I'm still perfectly with, and I actually think a little bit clearer.
That's the way it works. People who don't do it don't understand this. Once you get used to it, it's basically just becomes part of your chemistry, and it does not alter you in those ways that make you weird.
Yeah. But we had changed the opinion of that old man. He had sons that were, like, into cannabis, but like, I'm pretty sure he even admitted to having called the cops on his sons for their cannabis use. And then, like, he met us, and I had made him pizza because I was known for my pizza, and it was the first time he had ever eaten at my restaurant, and he had, like, I was sitting there talking, and then at one point I was, like, mid-sentence, and John just handed me a dab rig that he had just heated up, and he handed me a dab, and it was a big dab, and I did the dab, and I blew the big cloud out, and then I just continued mid-sentence back where I was, and I kept talking, and by the end of the night he was like, you've changed my opinion on it. And, like, we had even, you know, by the end of it, given that old man, like, edibles and stuff, and he experimented with cannabis when he had never considered it before us. We changed his mind on it because he didn't realize people could be highly functional.
Oh, yeah. You guys very much proved that. Very much.
Yep.
My God, Lily, so what is your theory as to why John was killed?
A couple months ago, when Paul was scared for his life, he told us I remember that he said he'd gotten in contact with the people that were trying to kill him, and he told them that we were the ringleaders. And those people probably did some research in us, and they said, oh, well, they got cameras, and they got a nice house, and they just threw this event. Must be right. And it was one of those things where we were about to throw in Acapulco again. It was right before it happened, and they probably didn't want us to cut into their profits for Acapulco this year. So it was one of those things where they probably, from my understanding, like it was a cartel hit. It was based off of their intel that we were selling coke, but their intel was Paul, and Paul was lying to save his own life. So it was one of those things where like they made a mistake, but they didn't know that. And I mean, I don't necessarily blame them, because like we were doing a lot better than Paul was. We weren't doing that well, but we were doing a lot better than Paul was. It made a lot more sense that we were the ones with all the money and the drugs, not Paul. Whereas like Paul had basically put it all up his nose and gave the rest of it away. Like he was literally giving money away to in Acapulco because he was too high to fucking pay attention. So what happened that day was, you know, they came for John, and I think that they shot Henza either because Paul told them about Henza was involved.
So the three of you were in your house, right? It was you, John, and Jason Henza.
Yeah.
Okay, and was it in the morning?
It was in the afternoon. In the morning, we had gone to the Central Market, dropped off Jason's bike at the motorcycle mechanic, bought a bunch of meat, like... Jason was buying, because Jason's on the carnivore diet too, so he was buying his meat supply from us. He'd give us like 1,200 pesos or something every week. We would buy all of his meat. I'd package it up and give it to him. And we got home. I made breakfast. I essentially packaged up all the meat. I made lunch. We sat down for lunch, and we weren't even done. We hadn't even started on our steaks, and Rebel Dog started barking. And Rebel started barking like there was a threat. And I was like... well, let me go look. And I would just like go and I would peek out of our bedroom window down the driveway at the gate. And I saw a couple of angry-faced young Mexican boys just pelting rocks at the house to get our attention. And John went in the house and he grabbed what weapons he had and he started tiptoeing down the gate, and I watched.
What kinds of weapons?
It was like a taser and I think a small handgun, like that's legal to have here if you're a homeowner. It wasn't registered, but it's one of those things where like he had it just in case. And I watched him. Last I saw of him was as he was tiptoeing around the truck down the driveway, and he knew it was a threat. You could see it. And he got outside the gate and he went to say something to him, realized they had guns, I think, and with the way he fell, he went to run. And they shot him in the ankle, shot him at least twice in the stomach, and he was done. And then I heard gunshots, and the first thing I thought was, I hope that's John shooting. And then, but it sounded too big. It didn't sound like that gun that we had, because we had shot it off just to try it. It was just a tiny little, like, it was literally this big, like, it was tiny. And by that point, I was hot-headed, because I knew they were threats, and like before the gunshots even went off, I ran outside and I had a machete in my hand, and I was standing at the top of the driveway, and I heard bang, 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 and I didn't see John fall, and then I look over and I hear more bangs, and I see Henza getting hit, and then I see Henza just drop like a bag of potatoes, and I look at the gate, and I saw a young Mexican basically, and I was just like, he had what it looked like it's a pistol that cops carry around, and he was holding onto the gate, and I didn't realize it at the time, but he was standing on top of John, and he had the gun, and he saw me, and he like definitely noticed me, possibly even recognized me, and then I just took off running and screaming, and I heard footsteps behind me, and I thought that was them coming after me, and I was so scared I didn't even slam the outside door of the house. So I just ran into the back of the house where I knew that the windows were blocked up. That's where the grow room was. And I got into that room, and I was sitting there crying like, oh my God, I'm about to be slaughtered. They're just going to come in and assassinate me, because I knew that the keys to get into that room were out just sitting in the house in the door, in the bedroom door, just locked into the door. And I heard footsteps, and I also heard a slam, and that slam was Jason running after me, running for his life. I saved his life by leaving the door open because he was being chased apparently, and he ran into the house, slammed the door, and got back to the grow room, and he's like, Lily, it's Jason. And I opened the door and I let him in, and we hid in there for about 20 minutes. And I was like, what about John? And he was like, John is dead. And I just couldn't think of anything, but I just screamed for a solid couple of minutes straight. screamed my baby over and over again. And I just sat there scared for my life as my friend was probably bleeding out in front of me. I thought Jason was gonna die. And I was like, I'm about to be stuck up on this house, in this house with a bunch of killers. My friends are dead, and I don't know what to do. And I eventually went out and I picked up Jason's phone and I picked up my phone. And then I remembered that my microphone on my phone was broken and I couldn't call for help. I didn't know what else to do, so I went live on Hens's Facebook. And the only person that responded in any way other than what's going on was our friend Michael Alexander, who lived down the hill. We had helped him move into his house. And he ran up the hill, and he ran through the crime scene, the war zone, and, like, risked his life. They could have been waiting for people to help, because, like, Mexicans will do that. They'll wait till you got somebody coming for help, or they'll follow you to the hospital and shoot that up, too. Like, there's hospitals here that refuse people with bullet wounds because of that. So, yeah, he risked it all. He had to step over his body to come and get us out of the house. And I thought about grabbing Rebel Dog, and I was just like, no, I'll be back for him. And I knew better. But I just ran out of the house, damn near screaming, and down the driveway, and then I saw John, and I just lost it. And they're like, come on, let's go. And I was like, I have to move him. I can't just leave him. He was laying in the most terrible position with his face mashed into the ground. And I was just like, I can't leave him like that. He's the love of my life. That's a disrespect. So I took 2 pictures of him, of how I found him originally. And I look at him to prove to myself all this is real. And I picked him up and I moved him. And I'll never forget things like the fact that his ankle was crushed. Or the sound that his head made as it lightly thud on the ground as I laid him down. And I just laid there with him and cried. And then I fled for my life. And I've been basically fleeing ever since, legally and otherwise. Because the killer saw me, the main killer anyway, and it's one of those things where, like, I'm a witness technically, but I'm not looking for that guy because it wasn't his fault. He was just a young guy put up to a job that wasn't really his. He had no idea who or what he was killing, like. Yeah, and then I contacted Judy and I told her son was dead, and she asked me, are you sure? And I said, there's no denying it. It's just been a fucking mess ever since. Nights are the hardest because I never realized I used to wake up and just reach over every night and make sure he was still next to me the whole time we were together, and now when I reach over there, it's just pillows. It was literally, it all happened in under a minute. That from the time when the dog started barking to when John was dead, it was under a minute. And that's the hardest part about this is, like, especially with all the speculation, Paula had the fucking balls to blame it on me. Like, why would I put this on myself? I literally lost everything I cared about. John was the only person I trusted with everything. He was my rock, he was my protector, he was who I could count on to handle shit in stressful times, and all, like, I'm stuck. Yeah, but I can never get the guy's face out of my head, and I can also never get John's face out of my head, or the way he felt so lifeless. He was never that lifeless before. It is definitely the most insane thing I've ever experienced, and it's something I would never wish on anybody. Nobody deserves to go through that. not the death itself or what I've had to endure since. So yeah, the long string of traumas that is my life just kind of got more traumatic. And then it's basically been a process of absorbing what people are saying, who's saying what, where they're getting their information from. And trying to keep myself calm because I know that my best defense is to stay calm and wait until I'm not facing deportation anymore.
So, you guys in October, this is now February, you said in October you checked on the status of your charges in Ohio.
Yeah. John was in kind of depressed state of mind. He also found out somebody in his dad's side of the family had died in the same night. But yeah, every once in a while he would check to see what the status of our charges were. And the last time he checked, they were standing. They were open, that it was still like the same state it had been since we left. It was basically we had run, the charges were open, because like a lot of people have been like, what about statute of limitations? Well, statute of limitations only counts if they don't charge you. And they had charged us. So those theoretically should have stayed forever until we handled them legally or like bought identities here, which is actually our plan.
Okay.
But yeah, it was one of those things where the night that I found out that my landlady told me that the police took my truck and 2 moving trucks from my house, I was fucking distraught because it was like, now I've really lost everything. And yeah, his mom, Judy's just like, well, I wanted to talk to a lawyer more about this because one of the charges is weird, but like, your case is closed back home. And I was like, you're fucking lying. And the next morning I went and I got internet and I did a search on myself and I owe the rest of the bond that I didn't pay because it was $10,000, 10%, and we paid $1,000. But especially the worst of the charges are closed.
So you could go back to the United States now?
Yeah, I would definitely probably be.
And you didn't know it?
And I had no idea.
And John could have gone back too, and he had no idea.
Yep. And it was one of those things where, like, even if, like, neither of us would have wanted to go back. But we could have hired lawyers to get rid of, that. And then we could have found a way to stay here legally, with our old identities. So, basically what I'm dealing with now at this point is because we came here illegally and we didn't have visas or any of it, and because he was murdered and the fact that they found, essentially a bunch of marijuana in the house. There was, a felony drug case, or not a felony, a federal drug case, and there's also a murder case open. And because they mark the house as a narco laboratory, they've taken my landlady's house and they're holding it hostage, essentially holding it hostage. It's their property until they can get the case closed, basically. Where I'm at now is I've raised money to pay a lawyer to find all of this information out for me and to get the process started of closing the case without me having to make a statement, because if I have to make a statement to the police, there's a good chance that I'll end up being deported. I don't want to leave this country unless I'm forced to. So what I've been told is essentially what it's going to take to have the house released, the case is closed, and also my things released to me is I have to pay $5,000 to the Mexican government for various fees and shit to make that happen. Because it's a whole legal process that they have to go through essentially to close the case and just not worry about it anymore. And yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm basically in hiding until I can get that money together, and then once I get that money together, then the case will be closed. The house will be returned to my landlady, and I mean, it's her dream house, so that's the goal. And then I'll get my things back, and then from there, it's basically working on getting myself legal citizenship, because I've said it many times, I'm done being an American. I want to be a Mexican, and I'm more Mexican in heart than I ever was American. So I will say my lawyer gets a kick out of me. He's never heard anybody coming into Mexico the way that most people go into the United States.
Exactly.
And yeah, he's kind of also surprised and respectful of the fact that, like, this happened to me in Mexico, but I understand that it's not Mexico's problem. It's the drug war's problem. If anything, the United States is to blame for this. Like, the United States government and their drug war, because it's like, if cocaine weren't illegal, there'd be no crazy-ass illegal market for it. If there was no crazy-ass illegal market for it, there'd be no cartel market and all of that. And, like, none of that would, none of this would be a problem. Like, it doesn't matter if we were selling cocaine or not at the end of the day. Like, this was just another tragedy in the drug war. They would have had no incentive to come after us if the legal situation was completely different.
Yeah. Legalization didn't save John, but it might save you.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the hope.
That's why this is no longer about, just letting teenagers get high on the weekends without busting them. This is actually life and death for a lot of people.
Yeah, there's still a lot of people that are dying because of cannabis, and honestly, like, who knows where we would have ended up in the world had we not been arrested. We always had plans to leave the United States, but who knows, maybe we would have ended up in Cambodia or something, and maybe things would have gone differently and John would still be alive. I don't at all regret coming to Mexico. I'm actually incredibly thankful I did end up in Mexico, because it was exactly what we needed when we got here. And in so many ways, it's still exactly what I need. I think about the idea of going home, and it's just like, I don't know if, like, for one, it would just be so weird. Like, I'm the type of person that at this point where, like, I drive by a taco stand and I'm like, they're cooking this kind of tacos just by the shape of the pan that they have. Whereas, like, I go home in the States and it'd just be like, everything's in dollars and lots of taxes and uppity people, and I'd be speaking in Spanish to everybody. And
so I'll tell you, despite my better inclinations, I do have a powerful savior instinct in me. Yeah. And so when I came across you and your story, of course, what kicks in immediately is, Lily, please come back with me. Please come back with me. We have a whole room, we have a whole floor in our house where you could stay in Oregon. I wanted to save you, of course. Yeah. But I understood immediately that you are not that person. You are not a person who wants to be saved. And you said
I used to be.
I know.
That was the thing.
And you said to me, I have an intense desire to be independent now. And here's what's happened in talking to you. I have gone from wanting to save you and bring you back to my house to simply wanting to come to Mexico more to hang out with you more.
And I welcome you to do that. And then, like...
Because what I mean is that I think long term, you are going to pull it off. What you came here for.
Yeah.
I think you're going to do it. Whether it's by yourself or with a new partner, I think you're going to finish the job that you and John set out.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, when John died, like, I remember, like, I'd always known, like, been aware of the fact that I had never been truly alone. But I remembered that. And then it was like, when I was trying to decide what I want to do, I have friends that are like, you can live with me for as long as you need, I'll take care of you, I'll pay your rent, I'll pay for your food and everything. Like, a friend that's offered that for me up to 5 years if I need it. But I found that idea, that kind of almost repulsed me, but it wasn't like, it was just like, I just want to take care of myself. And part of something that Judy said yesterday, his mom, was that she wants to put her own life back together because she's not where she wants to be financially, and she was so disappointed. Part of what made her really sad was she didn't even have the money to bring her son home to bury him. And, like, I have my own version of that. I didn't have the money to deal with this, and I don't ever want to be in this situation again where things are going wrong and I'm not capable of doing it on my own. And I've become a very independent person in certain regards, and, like, even if it's just for a couple months, like, I really crave the idea, and somewhat of the idea, of just going elsewhere in Mexico and just just me and my cat, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because that is the only bit of my furry family that I have left. All it took was going back to that neighborhood, screaming her name, and she came running, yowling at me.
Satoshi.
Yeah. And Satoshi was John's favorite cat he had ever owned. She slept between us every single night. So, and I know because of the time of day that he died, and she had a schedule every day, a play schedule where you could find her on the hill and the mountaintop. She loved that mountaintop. I know after we left, she went and she investigated, you know, she probably noticed, and I expected her to be more looking for him, and she hasn't looked for him once. But every time I've come sobbing, she's literally been wiping up the tears with nuzzles to the face. Definitely would be seriously lost without her. Kind of, and it is heartbreaking because, like, Satoshi was Rebel Dog's cat. Rebel loved cats. And they would play in the afternoons and they'd sleep together at night. It was Rebel Dog, me, John, and, you know, Satoshi all in bed together every night. There wasn't very much room. We'd wake up with cramps in our legs, but we were happy to do it.
I just, thank you.
Thank you for doing this. Most people don't go in depth. Like, we've told many of these stories to our friends, but it's one thing to tell them with their friends, and it's another thing to share them with the world. Because a lot of people have just what I've put out there and everything. And, like, we've put out a lot of our lives, but there was so much. And it was mostly about me. Like, you know, it was about my interests and things. And people always were like, well, why didn't John started to get into social media there at the end of his life, but it was one of those things where, like, yeah, most people just didn't get to know the beauty he was, and then a lot of them would, like, essentially meet him, and then he'd get into a discussion, and, like, if he felt something about something in a discussion, he would sit there and he would turn it over for hours. No matter how insignificant it would be it like a rule in his favorite board game or how the world should work, he would turn it over until it was done.
After observing him speak for a long time, because I've seen a lot of footage of the two of you being interviewed, and spending a lot of time with you and talking to a lot of people who knew him well, and the way they talked about his intelligence, including his mother and grandmother, it's a consensus that he had an extraordinary intelligence, that he was off the charts.
Yeah, the way Nana put it was like his maturity hadn't caught up with his intellect. So he was very smart and he knew it, and he could be very arrogant. Yeah. Was the word that he had used in his apologies to me before his death. Yeah. But it was catching up to him, so, like, he was becoming more of a man, less of an angry boy. So, like, he was maturing, you know, into his intellect. He was finally starting to catch up, you know.
Yeah. 27 years. He did a lot in 27 years. He did a whole lot in 27 years.
Yeah, he did more than
most people do in their entire lives, right?
Yeah. He always had big dreams. He always said, I won't settle.
So his death is one of the most tragic things I've ever encountered in my life.
Yeah.
But I am also simultaneously very excited for a beginning, because I'm very excited about what you are going to do.
Yeah, and like, in some ways, like, it is bittersweet, and is part of what, like, is keeping me motivated and somewhat positive, because, like, there's so many things that he taught me, everything from happiness as a state of mind to, you know, all of it, like, that didn't really make sense to me until after he was gone. So it's bittersweet because I'm figuring it all out and I feel more capable than I've ever felt in my life. But it's terrible because it's like, why did he have to die for me to see my self-worth?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
That's where I'm at. But I hope, like, if there actually is some spirit world that he's up there and he's looking down, because he was always so scared that if he were gone or if he wasn't able to take care of things, that everything would just fall apart. And that's the thing that's keeping me going, because I know if I just fall apart and give up, like, that's going to be the biggest insult to him that I could possibly give him. I keep saying I'm living for two people, and it doesn't mean I'm pregnant. It means that, like, he died way too young, and now I've got two lives to live in one.
Just live your own life.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Yours
That's part of why I crave independence too, is because like when you spend every minute of every day with somebody for 8 years straight, you don't really know where you start and where they stop.
Yeah. Yeah, no, your life is so special, and you are so special. I just know that you're going to do some things that I'm going to really enjoy watching. So I just want to thank you again for this, and I'm honored. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm happy to tell the story. I'm happy to show him for what he was, because...
And you.
Yeah, and me, like, we're... Yeah, it's hard to say that, but... Definitely miss the shit out of him. And for all the things I will gain out of this, I'd rather just have my old life back.
I know. Of course.
That would all be a lot more fun.
I know. Okay, thank you. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To donate to the film about John Galton and Lily Forrester, please go to statelessdoc.com. That's statelessdoc.com. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.